The reading was wrong, and Sarid checked it a fourth time before he let himself believe the instrument. On the wall of the observation gallery, the compliance trace should have been climbing. Every prior subject in the program's history had produced the same shape at this stage of exposure, a slow, grateful curve, the line of a mind letting go of itself. Sarid had watched that curve rise 10,000 times across a working life. He could have drawn it in the dark. It was the most reliable thing he knew. The line on the wall was falling. He set 2 of his 4 hands flat on the console to steady them and pressed the recalibration key with a third. The gallery hummed. Below him, past the thick daylight of the containment glass, the human sat in the assessment chair with the vector already 3 hours inside him, and he was watching the far wall as though he were waiting for a transport that was running late. Instrument fault, Sarid said, because that was the only category that fit. Log it and reset. Reset 4 times, second chair. The junior at the next station, Corin, kept his voice flat, the way they were all trained to keep it, but his throat sac had gone a pale, uncertain green. The trace is clean. The subject's uptake is nominal. He took the full delivery. It's just the response is inverted. Responses are not inverted. Compliance is a floor function. It does not go down. I know what it does, second chair. Then log the fault. Corin logged the fault. On the wall, the falling line kept falling, patient as water. Sarid had spent 40 years in the quiescence program, and he had never once had cause to raise his voice because the work did not require it. That was the entire point of the work. You did not argue a mind into surrender. You did not break it or bribe it or frighten it. You simply introduced the vector, and the vector found the small, deep room where every thinking creature kept its willingness to be led, and it opened that room a little wider, and then a little wider than that, until the door came off its frame and the subject discovered, with something that always looked like relief, that it no longer wanted anything the directorate did not want for it. The vector did not conquer. It reconciled. 40 years, and Sarid had come to think of himself less as a physician than as a man who talked frightened animals down off high ledges. Gently, so gently they thanked him on the way to the ground. He had never had one climb back up. He crossed the gallery and looked down through the glass at subject Umber 9. The human was young. Sarid had read the intake and knew the number. The creature was near the low end of its species' reproductive maturity, which the annex had flagged as an advantage, softer neural architecture, less set in its refusals. He was not large by the standards of his kind, the file said, though he was large enough that they had put him in the reinforced chair rather than the standard one. Dark hair cut close, a face that did nothing. Dirt still in the creases of his knuckles from the freighter they'd pulled him off of, because the intake washed on had not fully taken, and no one had bothered to run it twice. He wore the gray subject smock, and he sat inside the restraints without pulling against them, and his eyes moved once slowly, from the far wall to the observation glass, and found Sarid's silhouette behind it, as though the mirrored surface were not mirrored at all. Sarid was compliance physician, second chair, of the Osric Annex. He had overseen the reconciliation of 9 species and the individual reconciliation of a number of subjects he had stopped counting decades ago. He was, within the narrow room of his profession, a man of consequence. And when the human's eyes landed on him through a wall the human could not possibly see through, Sarid felt the oldest, most forbidden thing in his body move, a cold thread up the back of the neck, the animal knowing that something has taken your measure, and he stepped back out of habit before he understood he had done it. "He can't see you," Corin said. "I know he can't see me. The glass is. I know what the glass is." On the far side of it, the human went back to watching the wall. The vector had been in him 3 hours. By now the door should have been coming off its frame. They increased the delivery on the second day, because the protocol allowed for it, and because first chair Ossic, when Sarid brought him the inverted trace, looked at it for a long time with all four hands folded, and then said the thing that senior men say when the instrument disagrees with the doctrine. He said the instrument was young. He said the annex had refit the gallery sensors 11 cycles ago, and the new array had a known drift on low-signal reads. He said deathworlder biochemistry was famously loud and famously dirty, and that a species that had evolved on a world trying constantly to kill it would naturally throw noise across every channel they had. He said, finally, that the correct response to a strange reading was not to doubt the vector. The vector had reconciled the Sethon, who ate their defeated. The vector had reconciled the Uballer, whose warriors had once burned 3 of the Directorate's tithe worlds to slag before the program reached them. The correct response was to increase the delivery, gather clean data, and stop frightening the juniors. So they increased the delivery. Sarid ran the second session himself. He wanted to see it with his own eyes and not through Corin's flat voice and a drifting sensor. He went down into the assessment room, which he almost never did. Second chairs observed. They did not attend, and he stood a professional distance from the reinforced chair while the delivery ran, and he watched the human's face for the moment. He knew the moment. Every species had it. It came a little differently in each. The Sethon's crest went flat, the Uballer's breathing dropped into a slow, warm rhythm like a creature settling into sleep. But it always came, and it always looked, from the outside, like grief giving way to peace. The moment the door came off. The moment the subject stopped being a country with borders and became a province. Sarid watched for it, and the human watched him back, and the moment did not come. "You are called Umbernine here," Sarid said. He spoke the human's own trade tongue. The program required its physicians to reach fluency in the subject's dominant language, because words were part of the delivery, and a voice the subject trusted did half the work. His accent was careful. "Do you understand where you are?" "A station," the human said. "Orbit, big planet outside, I saw it on the way in, banded, gas giant." His voice was low and even and entirely without heat, and it did a thing that no reconciled subject's voice had ever done, which was that it asked its own question. "You're the one behind the glass yesterday." "I am a physician." You stepped back. The human's eyes moved over Sarid's forearms without alarm, without much of anything cataloging. "When I looked at you." You stepped back. The delivery was at full flow. The vector was going into him in a concentration that would have flattened a Sethon war priest inside a quarter hour, and the creature in the chair was reading Sarid's flinch off a 2-day-old memory. "That is not relevant to your session," Sarid said. "No," the human agreed. "Probably not." And he settled back against the restraints and looked at the ceiling, and that was all he had to say, and the compliance trace on Sarid's forearm display went on doing the impossible thing, the thing that was not a floor function, the thing that fell. Sarid stayed the full session. When it ended, he had the human's uptake numbers, which were nominal, better than nominal. The creature's body drank the vector down like a man drinking after a long march. And he had a compliance trace that had inverted so cleanly it looked less like a malfunction than like a design. And he had the small cold thread up the back of his neck, which had not left him since the first day, and which he did not have a category for either. He did not tell Osik about the thread. There was no field on the form for it. The annex was a good posting. Sarid had told himself this so many times across so many years that it had worn smooth. The way a repeated word stops meaning anything and becomes only a sound. It hung in high orbit over Halist, a banded amber world too large and too poisonous to ever set foot on, and the planet's enormous daylight came up through the observation domes at all hours, warm and gold and constant, so that the annex never truly had a night. Men said it was healthy. Men said the light kept the mind level. The compliance castes did well in that light. It was written into their old work that they did. Because Sarid was of the compliance castes. This is a thing that must be understood about him, though he did not, in those first days, understand it about himself. His people were called the Oridan. They were tall and narrow and pale as the underside of a leaf, with two great working arms and two smaller surgical ones folded most of the time against the chest, and a soft, translucent throat sac beneath the jaw that flushed with color when they felt what they were not, in general, encouraged to feel. They were physicians and archivists and reconcilers. They were the Directorate's gentle hands. For as far back as the Oridan kept records, and they kept excellent records, it was in their nature. They had been made careful. They had served, and served well and been valued for it. And if you had asked Sarid on the day the human arrived whether he was content, he would have looked at you without understanding the shape of the question, the way a fish would fail to understand a question about water. The Oridan did not refuse. It was not that they were forbidden to. Refusal simply was not in them, the way flight was not in them. Somewhere back beyond their oldest records, before they were physicians, before they were careful, someone had reached into the deep small room where the Oridan kept their willingness to be led, and had taken the door off its frame and thrown the door away. Sarid did not know this. No Oridan knew it. It is the particular genius of that kind of work that the reconciled do not remember the room, or the door, or that a door was ever a thing a person could have. The vector that had done it to them ages ago, and the vector Sarid delivered now into the young human's blood, were the same tool. The Directorate did not advertise this. But it was true, and it is the reason this account matters, and it is the reason the falling line on the gallery wall was not, as First Chair Ossick insisted, an instrument fault. On the fourth day the Directorate's oversight arrived, because the annex was required to report anomalies up the chain, and Ossick, whatever he said aloud, had filed the trace as an anomaly. The oversight came in the person of a Varine. The Varine were the Directorate, not all of it but its face and its hand, a tall people, slate-purple, smooth, unhurried, with long grave faces and eyes set close and black, and voices that never rose because nothing in their world had ever failed to obey a Varine voice. Where the Oridan had been made gentle, the Varine had made themselves certain. They did not doubt. Doubt was a thing that happened to other species. The one who came to the annex was a legate named Vox, and he moved through the arrival dome with two of his own attendants, and a stillness that made the Oridan staff lower their eyes without being told. And he found Sarid in the gallery and stood beside him looking down through the daylit glass at the human in the chair, and he said, "Show me the fault." "There is no fault, legate." First Chair Ossick logged an instrument fault. First Chair Ossick was being hopeful, Sarid said, and then was surprised at himself, because that was very nearly a criticism of a superior, and the surprise showed in his throat sac, a faint unwilled amber, and he folded his lower arms over it. The instrument is sound. The reading is real. The subject is taking full delivery and producing an inverted compliance response. I have never seen it. It is not in the literature. I have checked the literature. Legate Vox looked at the falling line for a while. Then he looked at the human. "It is a deathworlder," Vox said, as though that were an answer, and in the Directorate it was very nearly a complete one. "You have not worked one before." "The annex has never received one, legate. The program has processed one, previously, off record, a long time ago. The file is sealed above my access." "The file is sealed above everyone's access," Vox said, mild, and did not elaborate, and the small cold thread moved up the back of Sarid's neck again, because a sealed file is a thing that had an outcome someone did not want repeated. Below the glass, the human turned his head and looked up at the gallery at the exact place where the two of them stood, unerring, through a wall he could not see through, and Legate Vox, who was the Directorate's face and hand, who did not doubt, went very still for the length of a breath before he mastered it. "Increase the delivery," the legate said. "Gather clean data and keep it in the chair." Then he left the gallery, and he did not look down through the glass again on his way out, and Sarid noticed that too and filed it because he was made careful. They increased the delivery a third time on the 6th day, and a fourth on the 9th, and by the end of the second week they were putting into the young human, every session, a concentration of the vector that the program's own safety literature described as the theoretical ceiling, the dose beyond which no further compliance was obtainable because there was, in a normally constituted mind, no further self left to give away. Sarid stopped delegating. He ran every session himself now. He told himself it was rigor. It was not rigor. It was that he could not stay away. The human endured it. That was the word Sarid found himself using in the private log he had begun to keep, a log that was not on any annex form, a thing he had never done in 40 years. He wrote endured, and then looked at the word for a long time because it was the wrong word for what should have been happening. Subjects did not endure the vector. Enduring was a thing you did to an enemy. The vector was not an enemy. The vector was a reconciliation. And yet the young man in the chair took the theoretical sealing of it into his blood, session after session, with the set, patient, faintly bored expression of a creature waiting out weather, and the compliance trace fell, and fell, and by the 9th day it had gone below the instrument's floor in the gallery software, which had never in its design been asked to render a negative compliance value, simply stopped drawing the line and displayed instead a small polite error and the words out of range. "What is happening to him?" Corin asked once quietly, when the two of them were alone in the gallery and the human was asleep in the chair below, and it was a real question, not a form. Sarid did not have the answer yet. He had the beginning of it, which was worse. "Nothing is happening to him," he said. "That is the difficulty. We have put enough of the vector into him to reconcile a warship's crew, and nothing at all is happening to him." He watched the sleeping human, the slow rise of the strange barrel chest, the dirt still in the knuckles. "It is happening to the vector." The vector, when they pulled it back out of him and put it under the array, was no longer the vector. Sarid had the sample chamber to himself when the analysis resolved, which was mercy, because his throat sac betrayed him completely, and there was no one to see it. The color he flushed was one the Oridan had a word for but rarely occasion to use, a deep, drowning violet, the color of a man looking over the edge of a thing he cannot unsee. The tool they put into subjects was elegant and simple. It went into a mind and it found the room and it widened the door and it did not itself change. It was a key. Keys did not become other things. A key that reshaped itself in the lock was not a key. It was alive, or it was a lie, and the vector was neither. The thing they pulled back out of the human had reshaped itself in the lock. It still carried the vector's signature, the way a melted coin still carries the ghost of its stamp. But the working face of it, the part that reached for the room and the door, had been turned. Turned all the way around, the way you might take a tool meant to open and hone it patiently into a tool meant to close. It no longer sought the room where willingness was kept. It sought the vector itself. It had been rebuilt, inside the young man's blood, into a thing whose entire purpose was to find the quiescence vector and end it. His body had taken the key they made and filed it into a lock breaker. Sarid sat with that for a long time. He was a careful man. He made himself say the careful version. The human's physiology under assault from a foreign agent had not merely resisted. Resistance he could have written up. Resistance had a field on the form. It had disassembled the agent and reassembled it against its makers. And the reassembled thing was not inert. It was catalytic. A single unit of it, introduced to a fresh sample of unaltered vector in the array, walked through that sample and unmade it, unit after unit, patient as the falling line, until there was no vector left in the dish at all, only the turned thing, more of it now than there had been, having made copies of itself out of the corpses of the key. He ran that test 4 times. He was by then a man who ran things 4 times. Then he sealed the chamber, and he did not file the result on any annex form, and he went and stood in the gallery above the sleeping human until the daylight of Halist came up gold through the dome and touched the dirt in the young man's knuckles. And he understood, the way you understand a change in the weather in your joints before the sky shows it, that the annex was standing on something that had already broken and had not yet begun to fall. "You have to tell the first chair," Corin said. Sarad had shown him. He should not have. The boy was junior, the boy's throat sac had gone the pale, sick green and stayed there. But Sarad had needed one other person to have seen the thing so that he would know he had not gone mad, and Corin was the one who was there. "I will tell the first chair," Sarad said. He did not tell the first chair. Not that day. He told himself it was because Ossic would hear it as another instrument fault, would fold his 4 hands and say the array was young, would order the delivery increased, and Sarad could not. The word arrived in him with a strange heat, put more of the vector into the young human, because he had begun to understand that every session was not treating the subject. It was feeding the lock breaker. They had spent 2 weeks handing the human raw material and asking him politely to build the thing that would end them, and he had, because that was apparently what his kind did with a poison. They improved it. That night, the annex's arbitrary night, the dimming of the domes to a warm amber dusk that was still brighter than most worlds' noon, Sarad did a thing he had never done. He sat in his quarters and he did not sleep, and he turned the day over and over, and at some point in the turning he noticed that he was angry. He had no framework for it. The Oridan did not become angry. Anger required a self that felt itself wronged, a border that felt itself crossed, and the Oridan had been made without borders so long ago that they had no folk memory of ever having had them. What Sarad felt, sitting in the amber dusk, was the sensation of a border he did not know he possessed being pressed against from the inside. It frightened him more than the analysis had. He put 2 hands over his throat sac in the dark, though there was no one to see the color, and he sat very still until the feeling passed, and it did pass, but it left a mark, the way a first crack leaves a mark, and Sarad, careful man, noted the mark, and did not yet let himself ask what had made it. The human had been in his blood for 2 weeks. The staff who handled the human breathed the same recycled air the human breathed. The lockbreaker was catalytic and it was shed. The analysis had been unambiguous about that. The turn thing came off the subject in every medium they sampled, breath and sweat, and the trace warmth of his skin. It was not, in the concentrations the staff were exposed to, doing anything so crude as reconciling them. The Oridan were long since reconciled. There was no door left in them to open or to close. But the lockbreaker did not care about doors. It cared about the vector, and the vector was in the Oridan. It had been in the Oridan for ages beyond their records, holding the old, wide-open doorways of their minds ajar, so quietly, and for so long that they had forgotten a door was a thing they had ever had. Sarad did not know any of this yet that first night. He knew only that he had felt a border, and that the feeling had frightened him, and that under the fright, unfamiliar and enormous, there had been something that felt almost like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. On the 15th day, the human spoke to him without being spoken to first, which subjects did not do. Sarad had come down into the assessment room to run a reduced session. He had begun, quietly, cutting the delivery, logging the full ceiling and administering a fraction, a small treason he told no one, and the human watched him prime the delivery line with those cataloging eyes and said, "You're giving me less." Sarad's hands did not stop. "The delivery is per protocol." "No, it's not. First week it burned going in. Cold, then it burned. Now it's just cold." The human tilted his head, unhurried, reading. "You cut it 4 or 5 days ago. You keep logging the same number on the pad, but you cut what actually goes in." He was not accusing. He said it the way a man remarks on the weather he has been standing in. "Why? You are mistaken about the delivery." "Maybe." The human let it go the way he let everything go, without weight. Then into the quiet. "You want to ask me something. You've wanted to for a week. You come down here and you set it all up and you almost ask and then you don't." His eyes came up to Sarad's face. "Ask." The room was very bright. Halist's daylight poured down through the assessment dome and lay in a hard gold band across the floor between the physician and the chair, and Sarid stood on his side of it and the human sat on his, restrained, dosed past the theoretical ceiling of surrender, and utterly, immovably himself. "Why does it not work on you?" Sarid said. It came out of him lower than he meant it to. "It has worked on everything. It worked on peoples who ate their conquerors. It has never once failed. Why does it fail on you?" The human considered the question with the seriousness Sarid had already learned he brought to everything, this creature who hurried nothing. "I don't think it's failing," he said at last. "I think it's doing exactly what it does. It found the part of me that's supposed to roll over." He shrugged inside the restraints, one shoulder. "There just isn't one. Not the way you're built to find it. Push on where it should be and you're pushing on, I don't know how to say it in your grammar, on a wall that's load-bearing. On the thing that's holding everything else up." He looked at the gold band of daylight on the floor, then back up. "You push on that and it doesn't fold. It pushes back. That's not a choice I'm making. I couldn't stop it if I wanted to. It's just how the wall is built." "Every mind has the room," Sarid said. "The willingness to be led. It is not a weakness. It is how thinking creatures live together." "Sure," the human said. "We've got the willing part. We line up, we take orders, we bury our people and salute and go back to work. I've done all of that." Something moved far back in the even voice, not heat, more like the memory of heat, a banked thing. "But it's a thing we hand over. It's not a room you can walk into and take. You reach in to take it and you trip the other thing." He said the next part simply, and it was the most frightening thing Sarid had heard in 40 years, because it was said without any pride at all. "The other thing doesn't have an off switch. It's not built to negotiate. It's built to still be standing when everything else is gone." Sarid stood in the daylight and did not deliver the session. "You have been dosed," he said, "past the ceiling of your species' recorded tolerance. Every session, for 15 days. Do you understand what that means? It means we have tried with everything the program has to open you, and you sit there and tell me there is nothing to open. I'm telling you there's nothing to open the way you open." The human's voice stayed level. "You keep making the same move because it's the only move you've got and it's always worked. I get that, but you're a smart man. You've felt it, haven't you? Something wrong on your end, not just mine." He looked at Sarid with a flat, terrible kindness. "You stepped back that first day, through a wall you can't see through. That wasn't nothing. That was the oldest part of you doing the same thing my wall does, standing up before the rest of you knew why." Sarid did not deliver the session. He primed the line and logged the ceiling dose, and administered nothing at all and left the assessment room. And in the corridor outside he had to stop and put a hand against the daylit wall because the border inside him was being pressed again. From the inside, harder this time. And this time under the fright there was a question, fully formed, that he could not unask. "Why did I step back?" First Chair Ossic summoned him on the 16th day, and Sarid went up into the first chair's office at the top of the annex where the daylight was strongest, and he thought, walking in, that he would tell him. He would show him the analysis. He would say the words. His body turned the vector into a weapon against the vector, and it is shed and it is in our air, and I have felt something move in me that has no name in our language. And I think, First Chair, I think we have all of us been carrying the very thing that is now being unmade, and I think when it is unmade in us, we will discover what we are without it. He rehearsed it in the lift. He meant to say it. Ossic did not give him the chance. The first chair stood at the great window with his 4 hands folded and his back to the door, and against the amber blaze of Halist he was a tall, narrow silhouette, and he said, without turning, "Legate Vox has reviewed the file. The reduced delivery logs." Sarid's throat sac betrayed him. He was grateful Ossic's back was turned. "First Chair, you falsified the delivery record." Ossic's voice held no anger. The Oridan had no anger. It held something worse, a sorrowful certainty, the tone of a physician delivering a fatal reading. "For 6 days, you logged ceiling doses and administered fractions. You did this without authorization and without informing your first chair." Now he turned. His long pale face was very still. "I have known you a long while, Sarid. I will ask you a question and I want the true answer. Why?" And Sarid, who had rehearsed the whole confession in the lift, opened his mouth to give it and found that he could not. Not because he was afraid, though he was. Because the words spoken aloud in this office, in this light to this man, felt like handing over the one load-bearing thing he had discovered he possessed. It felt like walking someone into the room and letting them take it. And the oldest part of him, the part that had stepped back through the glass, stood up before the rest of him knew why and held the door. "The subject was destabilizing under full delivery," Sarid said. "It was not the truth. It was not entirely a lie. I reduced to preserve the subject for study. It was a clinical judgment. I should have logged it openly. I did not. That was my error." Asik looked at him for a long moment. "Legate Vox will resume full delivery himself," the first chair said. "You are removed from the subject. You will remain on the annex, and you will assist the analysis, and you will not enter the assessment room again. Do you understand?" "I understand, first chair." "Do you?" Asik crossed the bright room and stood closer than the Oridan stood, and his throat sac, Sarid saw it and could not look away. His throat sac was flushed, faintly, with a color Sarid had never once seen on the first chair in 20 years of service, a color that was not sorrow and was not certainty. It was the pale, sick green of Corin in the gallery. It was fear. "Sarid, what is on that subject's file that Vox will not let any of us read? What did the program do the last time it had one of these? And why," the first chair said, very low, "have I not been able to sleep since it came aboard?" They stood in the daylight, two reconciled men who had never in their lives had a border to defend, and felt, neither of them yet with words for it, the doors coming quietly off their frames. "I don't know what's on the file," Sarid said. "That was true. But I know what's happening to us. And I will tell you, first chair, if you will hear it as a reading and not a fault." Asik folded his hands. "Tell me." So Sarid told him. He told it plainly, the way the human told things, without hurry and without pride. The turned vector, the lock breaker, the shed catalyst in the air. And then he told the part that had no field on any form, the part he had turned over in the amber dusk. He said, "The vector we deliver is the same tool that made us." He said, "It is in us, first chair, it has been in us since before our records. It is the reason there is no anger in us and no refusal and no border. It holds our old doors open." He said, "And the human sheds a thing that hunts the vector, and we have been breathing it for 16 days, and it does not care whose vector it finds." He said, "I stepped back from him through a wall I cannot see through, and you have not slept, and Corin's color will not settle, and these are not faults, first chair. These are the doors, ours, coming off." Asik listened to all of it without moving. When it was done, he was quiet for a long while, and then he did a thing that no first chair had ever done in Sarid's presence, a small thing, enormous. He said no. Just that. He was not refusing the reading. He was trying the word. He said it again, quietly, testing the shape of it in his mouth like a man who has found a tooth he did not know he had. "No, no." His throat sac blazed. He looked at his own two upraised working hands as though they belonged to a stranger. "I have never," he said, and stopped, and Sarid watched the oldest man he knew discover in the strongest daylight on the annex that he had a self, and that it could decline. Below them, 40 years of reconciled silence began, very quietly, to come apart. Legate Vox resumed full delivery on the 17th day, and he did it himself in the assessment room, with his two Verine attendants standing at the door and the Oridan staff cleared out, and Sarid was not permitted to watch. He watched anyway. There was a maintenance channel above the assessment dome, a crawl space for the daylight diffusers, and Sarid had been on the annex 40 years and knew its bones, and he lay in the warm, bright dust of the crawl space with his throat sac dark against the metal, and looked down through the diffuser grill at the top of the human's head, and the tall slate-purple shape of the legate priming the line with his own hands. The Varine did not speak to subjects, it was beneath them. Vox ran the delivery in silence, at the full ceiling, and then above the ceiling, Sarid saw the numbers on the wall repeater and his hands went cold, above the theoretical ceiling, into concentrations the safety literature did not describe because no one had ever thought to ask what lay past the point where a mind had no more self to surrender. Vox was not trying to reconcile the human anymore. Sarid understood that watching. The legate had read the analysis. The legate knew the human turned the vector. Vox was not delivering a key. He was delivering a flood, past every ceiling, trying to drown the lockbreaker in raw material faster than the human could turn it, or trying. And this was the colder thought, to simply kill the subject with the tool, and log it as a tolerance failure, and seal the file above everyone's access the way the last one had been sealed. The human took the flood. His head went back against the reinforced chair. His hands closed on the rests, the dirt-creased knuckles whitening, and his breath came fast and shallow through his teeth. And Sarid, lying in the daylight above him, saw that this was costing the young man everything he had, that endurance was not the absence of pain but the paying of it, coin after coin, without stopping, and still the human did not cry out, and did not beg, and did not. Sarid saw with the drowning violet rising in his throat again, break. Somewhere past the second hour Vox leaned down, close to the human's ear, and said the only thing Sarid heard him say in the whole session, in the human's own tongue, cold and quiet and certain. "You will yield," the legate said, "because everything yields." And the human, with his head back and his teeth bared against the flood, laughed. It was a terrible sound, thin and wrecked and entirely without fear, and he turned his head a fraction toward the Varine and got the words out one at a time, spending them like the last coins he had. "You've never," he said, "met anything," he said, "that didn't." Vox straightened. For a moment, Sarid would swear to it the rest of his life. The legate's certain, slate-purple stillness cracked, and something looked out through the crack that the Varine were not supposed to contain, and it was the small cold thread, the animal knowing, the thing that stands up before the rest of you knows why. Then the legate mastered it and shut the delivery down and left the assessment room without another word, and the human sagged in the restraints, soaked and shaking and alive, and lifted his eyes impossibly, unerringly, to the daylight diffuser grill where Sarid lay in the dust, and held them there a moment, and then let his head fall and slept. He knew I was there, Sarid thought, climbing back through the annex's bones with his 4 hands unsteady. He knew, and he did not give me away, and I do not know why, and I have to know why. Below him, the annex went on pretending to be a good posting. The awakening did not announce itself. That was the thing Sarid would try later to make the record understand. It did not come as revolt. There were no speeches. No one stormed a door. It came the way frost comes to water, from 100 points at once, quiet, and then all at once solid. It came as a junior archivist named Pell who stopped, in the middle of transcribing a delivery log, and stared at her own 2 working hands for a long while, and then walked out of the archive and stood in the daylight of the central dome and would not say why, and could not be made to. It came as a diffuser technician who declined a reassignment, declined it, the word going through the annex like a struck bell, because there was no protocol for an Oridan declining. The forms had no field for it. It came as Corin, whose throat sac had never resettled, saying to Sarid in the gallery, apropos of nothing, in a voice of pure wonder, "I don't want to do the delivery anymore. I've never not wanted to do a thing before. Is this what it's like? Is this what everyone else has always?" And then stopping because he had no more words, because none of them had the words, they had been made without the words. It came most of all as the color. The Oridan throat sac had flushed, for as long as the Oridan had records in a narrow band, sorrow, care, the soft ambers and greens of a gentle reconciled people. Now up and down the annex, in the archive and the galleries and the long daylit corridors, The sacks of grown physicians were blazing colors their owners had no names for, deep violets and hard startled whites, and a furious high red that one old orderly wore for a full day before he found out, from the human, what it was. Because they had begun to go to the human. Sarid did not sanction it. He could not have stopped it. One at a time, off the logs, in the arbitrary night when the domes dimmed to amber dusk, the reconciled men and women of the Osric Annex found reasons to pass through the assessment corridor, and to pause at the observation glass, and to look down at the young human sleeping or waking in the chair, and some of them, greatly daring, went in. Sarid learned of it from Corin, who had gone in himself, and who reported it back with his throat sack blazing that furious high red, and who said the thing that Sarid would carry to the end of his life. "He named it for us," Corin said, "the red. I went in and I stood there and I couldn't. I had this thing in me and no word for it, and I showed him. I don't know why. I just tipped my head back so he could see the color, like a fool, like an infant, and he looked at it and he said," Corin's voice caught. "He said, that's anger. He said somebody did something to you that you had no right to have done to you, and the part of you that should have stood up for you was held down so long you forgot you had it, and now it's standing up, and it's late, and it's owed, and that's what the red is. He said it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, like naming a color for a child." Corin looked at Sarid. "Second chair. We were made, weren't we, like the subjects? Somebody reached in and took our doors, and we don't remember it because that's the whole trick of the thing. You don't remember the room once it's open. He knew. He knew before we did. He's been sitting in that chair watching us not know what we are." "Yes," Sarid said, "we were made. And it's coming undone." "Yes." Corin's red settled slowly into something quieter, a color Sarid had also never seen, a low, steady gold like the daylight of Halist itself. "Good," Corin said, and it was the first thing Sarid had ever heard an Oridon say that a Varine had not, somewhere far back, decided for him. Good. The human, for his part, endured and watched, and named their colors when they showed them to him, and asked for nothing. That was the thing about him that undid Sarid more thoroughly than the analysis, more than the border, more than the word no in the first chair's mouth. The human had every reason. He had been taken off his freighter and flooded past every ceiling with a thing meant to unmake his mind, and he sat in that chair in a facility full of the very people doing it to him. And as those people began, one by one, to come apart and wake up and discover they could refuse, as they came to him, blazing colors undefended, some of them close enough to touch, close enough that a strong young man could have done a great deal of harm, he did nothing. He asked for nothing. He did not once try to turn the waking to his use. Sarid tested it. He is not proud of this. He records it because the record must be true. On the 20th day he went into the assessment room, forbidden, Vox's order. He went anyway, and he stood close to the human, closer than was safe, with his 4 hands unbound and the daylight hard on both of them, and he said, "The restraints have a manual release. I know where it is. If I opened them and gave you the corridor codes, you could reach the shuttle bay. There is a maintenance skiff. You could be gone before Vox's watch cycled." He watched the young man's face. "You could take the codes and go, or you could take the codes and not go and wait, and when a physician came in alone you could—" He stopped. He made himself say it. "You could hurt someone, use one of us to get further than a skiff. It is what any of the subjects the vector never reached would have done. It is what your file is afraid of. Tell me you have not thought of it." The human looked at him for a long moment. "Course I've thought of it," he said. "I think about it every hour. I've mapped the corridor from the sound of the doors. I know which of you comes in alone." His voice did not change. "I could break your arm before your friends outside got the door open. I've decided which arm. The lower left, the small one closest when you lean in. You lean in when you talk to me. You've done it 3 times today." Sarid went very still. "I've thought about all of it," the human went on, level, patient, terrible. "And I'm not going to do any of it. Not because I can't. Because the second I use one of you to get out, I'm the thing they told you I am. I'm the deathworld animal that turns on the hand near its mouth. That's the file. That's what Vox is waiting for me to be, so he can log it and seal it and go home certain. He shook his head slow. I'm not going to hand him that. I'm going to sit in this chair and take what he does and not break and not bite, and I'm going to be the most boring, most harmless thing that ever refused to yield. And I'm going to watch every one of you find out you've got a door. He almost smiled. It did not reach anything. That's the whole play, Doc. That's the only weapon I brought. I endure and it spreads, and I never once give him the animal. He can't seal a file on a man who just sat there. Sarad stood in the daylight with his lower left arm, the small one, the near one, the one the human had already chosen and chosen to spare, hanging unbound at his side, and he understood, finally and completely, what he was looking at. It was not a weapon. That was the thing the Directorate's whole science could not hold, the thing that had no field on any form. Vox had come expecting a weapon, a deathworlder, a thing that killed, and had prepared himself to meet violence with certainty and win, because certainty always won against violence. That was the entire architecture of the Directorate. But the young man in the chair had brought no weapon. He had brought only a wall that would not fall and a refusal to become the thing they needed him to be. And he was patient past every ceiling, and he was going to sit in this daylight and endure them into freedom whether they liked it or not. You could not put certainty against that. Certainty had nothing to push on. It was like the human said, you pushed on the load-bearing wall and it did not fold, it pushed back, and it was not even a choice. It was just how the wall was built. Why did you not give me away? Sarad said. In the crawl space, Vox would have you knew I was there. Because you cut the dose, the human said. 6 days, logged the ceiling, gave me a fraction. You didn't know what you were doing yet, not really, but the oldest part of you did. Same part that stepped back through the glass. He looked at Sarad with that flat, terrible kindness. You had a door before any of the others. I wasn't going to be the one to hand it back to Vox. He settled against the chair, tired, endless. Go on, Doc, lean in again. Ask me the thing you actually came to ask. Sarad leaned in, the lower left arm near his mouth unbroken. What is on your file? He said. The last one, the one the program had before you. What happened? The human's eyes went, for the first time, somewhere far away, and when he spoke it was the only time in all of it that his voice carried the banked heat instead of the level cold, and Sarad understood that this, and not the flood, and not the ceiling, was the thing the young man had been enduring all along. I don't know what's on your file, the human said, but I know what's on ours. We keep records too. He was quiet a moment. A long time ago your Directorate took a human, first one they ever got their hands on, and they did to him exactly what they're doing to me, and it went exactly the way it's going now. The vector turned and it spread, and a whole facility of made quiet people started waking up. His jaw set. And your Directorate looked at what that meant. Looked at what it would cost them if it ever got out that the thing holding their whole empire together comes apart the second it touches us. And they made a decision. He met Sarad's eyes. They didn't just kill him, Doc. They killed everyone he'd woken up, the whole facility, sealed the file. And they made a rule up at the top in a room your legate has stood in and I never will. Humans are never to be studied again. Never dosed. Never brought aboard, because we're not a subject. We're the one key that turns their lock the wrong way. He let it land. Somebody broke that rule to bring me here. And when Vox figures out it's already spread, that it's in you, in Corin, in the old first chair who can suddenly say no, he's not going to log a tolerance failure and go home. The banked heat quiet, sure. He's going to do what they did last time. He's going to burn the annex to keep the secret. Everyone you've watched wake up. Everyone who found out they had a door. He held Sarad's gaze. That's what's on the file, Doc. That's the clock we're on. So you'd better decide what your new door is for. The daylight of Halist lay gold and enormous across the assessment room, and outside the dome the banded planet turned, indifferent, and Sarad stood with his unbroken arm at his side, and his throat sac blazing a color he did not yet have a name for. and understood that the annex he had called a good posting for 40 years was a room that had already killed everyone in it once, and was preparing, very quietly, to do it again. Sarid did not sleep that night, and it was becoming a habit, and he was beginning to understand that the sleeplessness was not an affliction. It was the door. A reconciled mind slept easily because a reconciled mind had nothing to keep watch over. There was no self at the gate, no border to hold, so the nights went down smooth and empty. Now there was something at the gate. Now the nights had a keeper. And the keeper turned the file over and over in the amber dusk. A whole facility woken. A whole facility killed. A rule written at the top of the directorate that a human was never to be touched again, and would not let the mind go down into the smooth, empty dark, because the keeper had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said that the same rule had been broken to bring Theo aboard, and that when the breaking was discovered, the same solution would be reached. He rose before the domes brightened and went to walk the annex, because a body that cannot sleep must do something with the hours, and he found that he was not the only one walking. The Osric Annex in its arbitrary night had always been the stillest place Sarid knew, a made gentle people at rest, the corridors empty, the daylight dimmed to a low amber hush. Now the corridors had people in them. Not many at first, 3, 4, standing alone at the great daylit windows where the banded planet turned, or sitting on the floors of the galleries with their backs to the walls, awake, keeping watch over the new thing at their own gates. Sarid passed a diffuser technician he had known for 20 years standing at a window with her throat sac blazing a slow, uncertain violet, and she looked at him and said, "I keep thinking about my mother," which was a sentence that should have meant nothing and meant everything, because the Oridan did not think about their mothers, grief and memory being border things, self things, and the woman said it wondering as though reporting a symptom. "I keep thinking about my mother and it hurts, and I do not want it to stop." And Sarid said, "It will not stop," and she said, "Good." And that was the whole exchange, and it was the second time in a week Sarid had heard an Oridan say the word good about a thing no one had decided for them. By the 20th day it was most of the medical tier and half the archive, and it moved through the annex not in a line but in a scatter, the way the file had said it moved. 100 points going to solid, and Sarid began to keep a private count. Not of the vector's uptake anymore, that number no longer meant anything but of the doors. He counted them the way he had once counted reconciliations, and the numbers ran the opposite direction, and he found that the opposite direction was the only direction he had ever wanted to count in, and had never known it, because no one had ever offered him the choice of what to count. Theo endured a session on the 20th day that Sarid was not permitted to attend and attended anyway, from the crawl space, because the habit was fixed now, and the daylight in the diffuser channel had become a kind of chapel to him. Vox ran it. The legate had stopped expecting the vector to work and had started, Sarid understood, simply gathering the death of it, running the flood past every ceiling, sample after sample, watching the human's blood turn the tool faster each time, building the case that the subject was an uncontainable biological hazard so that, when the moment came to invoke the last protocol, the record would already be written. And the human took it, head back, teeth bared, paying the coins, and did not break, and at the end of it spent, he turned his head toward the diffuser grill where Sarid lay and said to the grill to the annex to no one Vox could see, "Count them, Doc. Whatever you're counting up there in the dark, keep counting. That's the number that matters now, not what he puts in me. What comes off?" And Vox, who did not know the crawl space had a keeper in it, looked up sharply at the grill and saw nothing and went back to his samples, and Sarid lay in the daylight with his throat dark against the metal and understood that the young man had known he was there every single time and had been talking to him for days, teaching him what to count through a grill, past a legate, without ever once giving him away. He went to Ossic on the 21st day, meaning to speak of the file, and found the old first chair already ahead of him, standing at the great window with the schematics of the annex glowing on the desk behind him, and Ossic said, before Sarid could speak, I have been reading the containment protocols. All of them, not as forms, as things a person wrote meaning to use them. His gold was steady and terrible. There is one at the bottom, old friend, that I had never read in 20 years because it is filed under a heading no first chair ever has caused to open. And it is the last time. It is written down, how to do it again, and a legate can invoke it alone. He turned. You have the file. I can see it on you. Tell me I am wrong about where this goes. You are not wrong, Sarid said. Then we do not have the days I thought we had, Ossik said. We have until he understands the count you are keeping, until he stops trusting the walls to hold us quiet. And when he does, the old man's gold flickered. It will come as an order, and then another order, and I have been standing at this window for an hour trying to decide what a people who were made unable to refuse do, when the refusing is the only thing left. And I have not decided, because I have never in my life had to decide anything. And I am 70 years old and 4 days awake, and I am afraid, Sarid, and the fear is mine. And I would not trade it back for all the smooth, empty nights I ever slept. They stood in the amber dusk over the map of the room that had killed everyone in it once, and Sarid told him then what he had not told him before, not the file. Ossik had the file, but the count, the doors, the number running the opposite direction. He said, it is spreading faster than he can flood, first chair. Every soul who wakes sheds it to the next. By the time Vox understands what the count means, it will already be past any purge, because he cannot vent what is already in the blood of everyone he would keep to run the vent. He said, the human told me to count them through a grill past the legate days ago. He has been 3 moves ahead of all of us since the hour they carried him aboard, and he has never raised a hand. And he never will, and that is the whole of his strategy, to be so harmless, so patient, so impossible to write up as the animal they came expecting, that when the killing comes it will have to come as naked murder in the daylight, in front of 140 witnesses who can finally see. He said he is not trying to survive, first chair. I have understood that only tonight. He does not expect to survive. He is trying to make sure that if they kill him, they cannot seal it, because the whole facility will already be awake to watch and awake to carry it out. He is spending himself as a door that cannot be shut. Ossik listened to all of it, and when it was done his gold had gone very deep, and he said quietly, then we must make certain his spending buys what he means it to buy. We must be awake enough and many enough, and decided enough, that when the legate reaches for the last protocol, he finds not a facility of quiet tools but a country of witnesses who will not lift the tool for him. He looked at his own upraised hands. It falls to us to be worth what the young man is paying. I do not yet know if we can be, but I know that I would rather fail at being a country than succeed at being a province for one more day, and I did not know that yesterday, and I know it now, and he gave me that, sitting in a chair being flooded past every ceiling, and I will not waste it. He straightened. Keep counting, old friend, and begin quietly to make the count known tier to tier in the dusk, the way it is already moving. Not an order, we are past orders, a knowing. When Vox moves, every soul on this annex must already understand what is being asked of them and must already have decided, alone and together, what they will answer. That is the only preparation a country can make, not weapons. Agreement reached in advance in the daylight freely. His gold blazed. Go and spread the knowing, Sarid. It is the first free work our people have ever been asked to do. Let us not be found wanting at it. And Sarid went, in the dimmed amber dusk that was still brighter than most worlds' noon, tier to tier, carrying not an order but a knowing, the file, the count, the clock, the thing the young man in the chair was spending himself to buy, and he watched it move ahead of him the way everything moved on the annex now, 100 points going to solid, and he understood, walking the daylit corridors with the door standing open in him, that this was the shape the end would take. Not a battle, never a battle, but a whole-made people, woken in the dark, deciding in advance and in the daylight that when the certain man reached for the last protocol, they would simply, all of them at once, decline to be his hands. It was the human's wall, built in a people who had never had one, in the little time they had, out of the only material they possessed, which was the knowing, freely shared, that they were a country now, and that a country does not lift the tool that ends itself, no matter whose voice gives the order, because it has finally, at the last and owed hour, become something with a self worth keeping. Legate Vox figured out the spread on the 22nd day, and he did it the way a careful man discovers rot in a beam, not by looking for it, but by leaning on something that should have held and feeling it give. He gave an order, and it was not obeyed at once. Sarid was in the analysis chamber when it happened. He heard it come apart over the annex channel. Vox had instructed the diffuser section to purge the assessment dome's air handling, to flush the recycled atmosphere the human breathed out into the dark and draw clean gas from the reserve tanks. It was a routine order. It was also, Sarid understood the instant he heard it, the first move of a man who had read the analysis and grasped that the thing shed off the subject was in the air and meant to stop breathing it. And the diffuser section, which was 3 Oridan technicians and a supervising archivist, took 11 seconds to acknowledge, and then the archivist's voice came back over the channel, and it did a thing no Oridan voice had done on that channel in the annex's history. It asked why. "Repeat the instruction," Vox said over the channel, even and cold. "I heard the instruction, Legate." The archivist's name was Oval. Sarid had known him 30 years. His voice was shaking, not with fear, with the enormous, unfamiliar effort of the thing he was doing. "I am asking the reason. The reserve gas is rationed for medical emergencies. Flushing the dome will draw it down by 1/5. I would like to understand the emergency before before I comply." Silence on the channel. Sarid stood in the analysis chamber with his 4 hands still and pictured the legate on the command tier, tall and slate purple against the daylight, hearing an Oridan use the word comply as though it were a thing that could be declined. "Archivist Oval," Vox said at length, "you are experiencing a clinical event. You are not well. Report to the medical tier, and someone will see to you." "I feel," Oval said, wondering, "extremely well, Legate. I feel better than I have felt in my whole life. I am going to keep asking why." Vox cut the channel. He did not flush the dome. He could not, the section would not do it, and the Varan, for all their certainty, were 3 aboard an annex of 140 Oridan, and certainty is a strange currency. It spends beautifully right up to the moment someone declines to take it, and then it is worth nothing, and the one holding it discovers he has been carrying paper. Vox had spent his whole life spending certainty. He had never once had it refused. Sarid, listening to the dead channel, understood that the legate had just learned the same thing the human had been teaching all of them. You push on the load-bearing wall and it does not fold, it pushes back, and there is nothing in your certainty that knows what to do with a wall. But Vox was not a fool, and a cornered certainty does not surrender. It escalates. That was the clock the human had named, and it had just started to run. Sarid went to Ossig. The first chair had not slept in 6 days, and it had not diminished him. It had done the opposite. He stood taller. His throat sack carried the low, steady gold now, most hours, the color Corin had found, and when Sarid came into the office, Ossig was not at the window. He was at the desk, and on the desk were the annex's schematics, and he looked up with the clear, terrible calm of a reconciled man who has discovered he has a self and has decided, late and owed, to use it. "He will try to burn us," Ossig said. "No preamble. You told me the file. I have not stopped thinking about the file. He has 3 of his own and a command tier and the annex's core protocols, and when he understands that the thing is already in 140 of us and cannot be flushed or contained, he will do the only thing his certainty leaves him. He will invoke a containment purge. It exists. I have read the protocol tonight for the first time in my life, really read it, not as a form but as a thing a person wrote meaning to use it. His hands were flat on the schematic. The annex can be vented, all of it, from the command tier on a legate's authority in the event of an uncontainable biological breach. It is designed to look like an accident afterward, decompression, tragic, the file sealed. He looked at Sarid. It is the last time made into a protocol. They wrote down how to do it again. How long? Sarid said. He needs the core to accept the authority code, and he needs the subject dead first or the purge is pointless. The human is the source. Venting us while he lives only buys time. Ossic's gold flickered. So it will come in an order, 2 orders, kill the subject, then vent the annex. And he will give the first one soon because every hour more of us wake, and 140 waking men are harder to vent quietly than 140 quiet ones. He straightened. We have until he stops trusting the walls to hold us. A day, less. The staff will not carry out the order to kill the subject, Sarid said. Oval would not even flush a dome. No, so Vox will do it himself or with his 3. Ossic's calm did not waver, and that was the most frightening thing because it meant he had already followed the road to its end. Sarid, I have to ask you to hear the next part as a first chair and not as a friend. There are 3 Varine aboard. There are 140 of us. If it comes to the door of that assessment room, if Vox walks down that corridor to kill the young man in the chair, we outnumber them past any certainty they carry. He looked at his own upraised working hands, the gentle hands, the reconciler's hands, the hands that had never in their long, careful history closed on anything in anger. And I do not know what we are without our doors held open. I do not know if we can do the thing that would have to be done. We were made unable to. That was the point of making us. He held Sarid's eyes. The human will not raise a hand. He told you why, and he is right, and I will not ask him to become the animal to save us. That is the one move that loses everything even if it wins, so it falls to us. And I do not know, old friend, whether a people made gentle can find in a day the thing our makers spent an age taking out of us. The daylight lay across the schematic, gold and enormous, and the 2 old physicians stood over the map of the room that had killed everyone in it once. And Sarid felt the border inside him, the wall he had not known he had, and pressed his hand to his own throat where the nameless color blazed, and said the truest thing he had ever said. Then we had better go ask the man who has spent 22 days learning how to refuse without becoming the thing they need him to be, Sarid said. Because that is the only lesson worth having, and there is exactly one teacher on this annex who knows it. They went to the human together. It was the first time the first chair had entered the assessment room. Ossic had run the program from galleries and offices for 20 years, and had never once stood in the daylight in front of a subject. And Sarid watched the old man cross the gold band on the floor and stop before the reinforced chair, and watched the young human take the measure of him with those cataloging eyes, and watched something pass between them that Sarid had no instrument for. You're the one at the top, the human said, the one who couldn't sleep. I am first chair Ossic. I ran this program. Ossic's voice did not hide from it. I have reconciled subjects for 20 years, believing it a mercy. I delivered the vector into peoples the way a man waters a garden. I did to a great many minds the thing that was done to mine, and I did it gently, and I thought myself kind. He stood very straight in the daylight. I am told now that a legate means to vent this annex and everyone in it to keep the secret of what you are. And I am told that stopping him may require my people to do a thing we were unmade to do. And I have come to ask you, you, who I have watched endure past every ceiling and never once bite the hand near your mouth, how a person refuses all the way to the end, without becoming the thing that deserved refusing. The old man's throat sack blazed gold. Teach me the wall, deathworlder. I have a day to learn it, and I have never in my life had one. The human was quiet for a long time. I can't teach you the wall, he said finally. You don't build it in a day. Mine took 100,000 years and a planet that tried to kill my kind every single morning until we were the kind of thing that doesn't fold. He shook his head slow. But you don't need my wall. You've got your own thing, and it's better than the wall, and you don't see it because you're looking at me." He leaned forward as far as the restraints allowed, and for the first time there was something in the level voice that was almost urgent, almost warm. "You've spent your whole existence learning exactly how a mind gives itself away. You are the galaxy's greatest experts on surrender, on the door and the room, and how you take the one and open the other. There is nobody alive who understands compliance the way you do." He looked from Ossik to Sarad and back. "You don't need to become killers. Vox is going to try to run this on certainty and authority and codes that everyone obeys. And you are the exact people who know down to the bone precisely how that machine works, because you are the machine. You've been the hands on it your whole lives. The banked heat, level and sure. You don't fight a legate's certainty with violence. You've got 140 people who know better than anyone in the universe how to make an order stop working, stop obeying all at once, everywhere, and watch what a man made entirely of authority has left when the authority won't spend." He sat back. "That's not the animal. That's not a hand raised. That's just the wall, your version of it. He pushes, and you don't fold and you don't bite. You just, every one of you, decline. And a legate with a purge code and nobody to input it is a man alone in a bright room holding a piece of paper." Ossik stood in the daylight, and his gold went very deep, very steady, and Sarad watched the last of the old first chair's 20 years of gentle certainty finish coming off its frame, and something older and harder and freer stand up in its place. "A strike," Ossik said softly, tasting the shape of it. "Not a fist, a silence. We stop being the hands." He almost laughed the way the human had laughed at the legate, thin and wrecked and unafraid. Every reconciled soul on this annex all at once declining to lift the tool. He cannot vent a facility whose systems will not take his code because the men who keep the systems have simply stopped. He looked at the human with something close to reverence. "You have been sitting in that chair, dosed past every ceiling, working this out. The one move that saves everyone and makes no one the animal." "I've had a lot of time," the human said, "and not a lot to do." He tipped his head back against the chair, spent, endless, alive. "Better hurry, though. He's going to give the first order soon. And when the annex doesn't take it, the flat kindness, the terrible calm, that's when he stops being careful." The first order came on the 23rd day, in the strongest daylight, and it was exactly the order Ossik had said it would be. Vox did not send it over the open channel. He was too careful for that now. He had felt the walls give under oval, and a careful man who has felt a wall give stops trusting the room. He sent it privately to the medical tier, to the 3 senior physicians of second and third chair who held the authority to administer a terminal delivery. An overdose logged as tolerance failure, the clean bureaucratic death the file had used before. The order named subject Umber 9. It cited an uncontainable clinical instability. It instructed the terminal delivery within the hour, and it carried a legate's authority code, which in the whole history of the Osric Annex had never once been questioned, because a legate's code was not a request. It was the shape the future took. Sarad was one of the 3 it went to. He read it standing in the analysis chamber with the daylight on the back of his neck, and he felt the old machinery in him try to turn, 40 years of turning, the reflexive yes, the body already rising to go and do the thing before the mind had finished reading it, and he felt the wall stand up under it. The border, the door, back on its frame at last and holding. He did not go. The second physician it went to was a third chair named Ivan, young, sharp, whose throat sac had been blazing the furious high red for 4 days, and who had spent those 4 days learning from Corin what the color meant. Ivan read the order, and Ivan Sarad heard this later and kept it, laughed out loud, alone in the delivery prep, and then keyed the response field and typed, with the enormous care of a person doing a thing for the first time in a life and a species, a single word. Declined. And then sat looking at it, at the word on the screen, at the impossible fact of it, until the tears came. The third physician it went to was old Seth, who had been reconciling subjects longer than Sarad, who had trained Sarid, whose gentleness was legendary on 3 tiers. And old Seth, whose door had not yet fully come off, whose gold was still fighting the last of the Vector's hold. Old Seth rose and gathered the terminal delivery and started for the assessment room, because the code was a legate's code, because that was the shape the future took, because 100,000 years of made-quiet obedience does not come off every frame at the same hour. They stopped him in the corridor, not with hands. Corin reached him first and stood in front of him in the gold daylight, undefended, and said, "Seth, old teacher, where are you going?" And Seth said, "The legate has ordered a terminal delivery. I am going to administer it," in the flat, reciting voice of the reconciled. And Corin said, "Do you want to?" And it was the question the human had taught them, the only question that mattered, the question that had no field on any form. "Do you want to, Seth? Set aside the code. Set aside the legate. Do you yourself want to walk in there and kill the young man who has been naming our colors for us?" And old Seth stood in the corridor with the terminal delivery in his gentle legendary hands, and the daylight of Halist poured down over all of them, and the annex held its breath, and something in the oldest reconciler on the station, some last door, older and more painted over than any of theirs, ground slowly off its frame. "No," Seth said. He looked at the delivery in his hands as though it had appeared there by sorcery. "No, I don't. I have never once in 60 years asked myself that question. No." And he set the delivery down on the corridor floor very carefully and put his back against the daylit wall and slid down it to sit on the ground and wept the way the newly freed weep, which is not like grief at all, though it looks the same. The order was declined. All 3. Within the hour, as the human had said, and everywhere at once, the way frost goes to solid. And Legate Vox, on the command tier, in the strongest daylight on the annex, felt the last wall give and stopped being careful. He came down himself. Sarid saw him on the corridor monitors. The annex's whole waking body was watching the monitors now, in galleries and archives and prep rooms. 140 freed and half-freed, and waking souls tracking the tall slate-purple shape as it moved down through the tiers toward the assessment room with its 2 attendants flanking it, and a terminal delivery unit in its own hands. Because if the hands of the annex would not do the thing, the Varine would do it himself, the way Vox had run the flood himself. Because certainty, when it finally understands it is alone, does not surrender. It decides to be the only hand that matters. Ossic met him in the assessment corridor. The old first chair stood in the center of it in the gold band of the diffuse daylight, alone, his 4 hands open at his sides, his throat sack blazing the deep steady gold, and behind him the corridor filled, not with a mob. There was no rush, no shout. That was the thing Sarid would never be able to make the record understand. It filled quietly, the way water fills a low place, Oridan after Oridan stepping into the daylight and standing, undefended, unarmed, hands open. A wall of made gentle people who had decided, each alone and all at once, that the young man in the chair at the end of the corridor was not going to be killed today. They did not raise their hands. They had been unmade to raise their hands. But they had not been unmade to stand, and they stood, and the corridor behind Ossic became solid with them, tier on tier of blazing throats and open palms, and the daylight lay over all of it, gold and enormous and merciless, and there was nowhere in it to hide what was happening. Vox stopped. "Stand aside, first chair," the legate said. His voice was still even. His certainty was still spending. But Sarid, watching on the monitor and then coming down into the corridor himself, taking his place in the wall beside Corin, saw the thing move behind the Varine's close black eyes, the small cold thread, the animal knowing, and understood that Vox had begun at last to add the numbers. 3. 140. Paper. "No," Ossic said. "You are experiencing a clinical event. All of you." Vox's gaze went down the packed corridor, the impossible blazing wall of them. "This entire annex has suffered a biological breach that has compromised your judgment. That is what the record will show. That is what happened here. You are not yourselves." "We are exactly ourselves," Ossik said, and his gold blazed, and his voice in the daylight was the voice of a man who has waited an age to say a true thing. "For the first time. You made us, Legate, your people, long ago. You reached into mine and took our doors, and you have used us as your gentle hands for so long that we forgot we were ever a country. And you did the same to 1,000 peoples and called it reconciliation and called it mercy, and watered your empire with it like a garden." He took one step forward, hands open, unarmed, immovable. "And then someone brought a deathworlder aboard, and he sat in that chair and took everything you had and never once raised a hand, and his blood turned your key into the thing that unmakes it, and it got into our air, and it found the old locks you left in us, and it broke them. That is what happened here, not a breach, a cure." He did not raise his voice. The Oridan had no anger, only this, the deep gold certainty of the newly owned self. "You cannot vent that, Legate. You cannot flush it or seal it or write it into an accident. It is in 140 of us, and it is spreading, and it does not stop at a door. And it is." The old first chair's gold flickered, and for the first time something like pity crossed his long, pale face. "It is in your own 2 attendants, Legate. Look at them. They have been breathing our air for 6 days. Look at their eyes." Vox did not turn to look, but Sarid in the wall did, and so did the whole waking annex, and it was true. The 2 Verine attendants flanking the Legate, tall, slate-purple, certain, the Directorate's own hands, had gone very still, and there was in their close black eyes the beginning of a thing the Verine were not supposed to be able to contain. Not fear. Something worse for a Verine. A question. The oldest and most forbidden thing. One of them, the one on Vox's left, had let the muzzle of his weapon drift a fraction toward the floor, and was looking at the wall of open-handed Oridan, and at the young human just visible in the chair through the assessment glass at the corridor's end, and his throat had no sack to blaze, but his face was doing the thing a face does, when a wall it did not know it stands up under an order it has always obeyed. "You too," Ossik said to him, gently, the way the human name their colors. "It reaches you too, you feel it. The thing standing up in you that has no name in your grammar. It is late, and it is owed, and it is yours." He looked back at the Legate, and the pity in his face did not soften the gold. "You are alone, Thrain Vox. You have been alone since the moment your certainty stopped spending, and you have not admitted it because you have never in your life had to. There is no one left to input your code. Even your own hands are waking up. Set the delivery down. There is nothing at the end of this corridor for you but a bright room and a piece of paper." The Legate stood in the gold daylight with the terminal delivery in his hands, and 140 freed souls between him and the young man he had come to kill, and one of his own attendants no longer certain at his side. And Sarid in the wall watched the last certain creature on the annex arrive at the place the human had been driving him toward for 23 days without ever once raising a hand. The place where certainty, having nothing to push on, must either break or do the one thing it has left. Vox raised the terminal delivery and looked over the heads of the wall to the assessment glass at the end of the corridor, to the young human in the chair beyond it, and Sarid saw the Legate make the calculation that certainty always makes at the end. That if the source were dead, even now, even too late, the spread might yet be slowed, the file might yet be salvaged, the Empire's secret might yet hold for one more age, and that there was one hand left on the annex that would still obey a Legate, and it was his own. "Then I will do it myself," Vox said, "because everything yields," and he moved for the assessment room, and the wall of gentle people who could not raise their hands closed in front of him, unarmed and immovable, and the daylight came down gold and enormous over all of it, and the young man in the chair, watching through the glass, did not move at all. A wall of unarmed people is a strange thing to break, because there is nothing in it to fight. Vox had trained for resistance his whole life, for the raised hand, the drawn weapon, the desperate lunge that certainty meets and masters. He had no training for a corridor packed shoulder to shoulder with gentle men who would not lift a finger and would not step aside, who simply stood in the daylight with their throats blazing and their palms open and let him come. He came. He put his own tall slate-purple body into the first rank of them and pushed, and they gave ground because bodies give ground, and they closed again behind him because water closes, and he pushed through a second rank and a third, and it was slow, and it was terrible, and it worked, because a wall that will not strike can be waded through by anything that does not care what it steps on. Sarid was in the fourth rank. He felt the legate come, the cold weight of him, the certainty spending itself as forward motion now that it could spend as nothing else. And he did not raise his hands, and neither did Corin beside him, and neither did any of them, and afterward Sarid would not be able to decide whether that had been the annex's great weakness or its whole strength, and he suspected, in the end, that it had been both, and that the two were the same thing seen from different sides. The legate's still certain attendant came behind him, and it was the attendant, not Vox, who did the harm. Old Seth had risen from where he wept and put himself back into the corridor near the front, and when the legate's push reached him the old reconciler did not give ground. He was tired and newly freed, and he had spent 60 years being moved and had just that hour discovered he did not have to be. And the attendant, still certain, still the directorate's hand, struck him aside. Not with a weapon. With an arm hard, the way you clear an obstacle, and old Seth went down against the daylit wall and did not get up, and something in the way he fell told the whole watching annex, in the space of a breath, that he was not going to. The corridor made a sound Sarid had never heard the Oridan make, not a shout, 140 throats all at once, taking the same breath. And the furious high red anger, the human had named it, the thing that stands up when someone does to you what they had no right to do, went through the packed corridor like fire crossing dry grass, throat to throat to throat. And for one moment, one terrible daylit moment, Sarid felt the whole newly freed body of the annex tip toward the thing they had every right to do, tip toward the attendant who had killed old Seth, tip toward becoming, at last and understandably and forever, a mob with hands that had remembered how to close. And from the end of the corridor, through the assessment glass, muffled but clear in the terrible held breath, the young human's voice. Don't. Just that level cold carrying. The corridor froze. 140 red blazing throats, and the source of all their waking watching them through the glass, restrained, dosed past every ceiling, and he had used the one word that could reach them because it was the word he had been living in front of them for 23 days. Don't, the human said again, and now there was the banked heat in it, urgent, spending itself to reach them. I know what he did. I know what you're feeling. It's the red, it's owed, it's real, and it is yours. But listen to me. Through the glass, through the daylight, to the whole tipping corridor. The second you close your hands on him, you become the thing that made you. You spend an age being someone's gentle tool, you finally wake up, and the first thing you do with your freedom is exactly what they do, take the one near your mouth and end it because you can. That's not your door opening. That's them, still driving from inside the anger they handed you. He let it land in the held breath. You want to honor the old man on the floor, then be the thing they could never make you, be the wall that doesn't fold and doesn't bite. Hold the red, don't swallow it, don't let it go, hold it, it's yours now, and don't spend it becoming them. That's harder than killing, that's the whole lesson, that's the only wall worth having. His voice dropped, even sure spent. Let him through, let him come do his worst to me, and watch it fail, that's the answer. Not his blood, watching his certainty die in the daylight with everyone free to see it. The corridor held. The red did not go out, the human had told them not to swallow it, and they did not, they held it blazing, owed theirs, but the hands did not close. Rank by rank in the gold daylight, the wall of gentle people who had just remembered anger chose, each alone and all at once, not to become the thing that had made them, and it was, Sarid thought, the most human thing he ever saw 140 aliens do. They let the legate through. Vox waited the last ranks and reached the assessment room door, and the still certain attendant came behind him, and the corridor let them, and Ossic alone came with them, stepping through his own freed people to stand in the doorway, unarmed, because a first chair does not send his people to a thing he will not witness. Sarid came too, and Corin, and Ivan with his red still blazing and his hands terribly open. They filled the assessment doorway, the freed and the waking, and they watched, because the human had said watch, and because the only weapon anyone had ever brought that could win this was a room full of made quiet people bearing witness in the daylight to whether certainty could kill what it could not understand. Vox primed the terminal delivery with his own hands. The human watched him do it. He had stopped long ago watching the far wall. He watched the legate now, level and unhurried, the way he had watched everything, and the dirt was still in the creases of his knuckles, 23 days on, because no one had ever run the washstone twice. "You will yield," Vox said, low, the same words, the last currency of a spent certainty, "because everything yields." "You keep saying that," the human said. His voice was very tired and entirely unafraid. 23 days, same line. "You ever think about why you have to keep saying it?" He tipped his head back against the reinforced chair, offering the delivery site the way he had offered it every session, because enduring is a thing you do with your whole body, and he had never once made them fight him for it. "You say it to me because you need it to be true. Because if it's not, if there's one thing in the whole galaxy that doesn't yield, then everything you built is a room you can't leave. And you've just watched 140 of your gentle tools walk out of that room in front of you. Flat, cold, kind. I'm the proof it was always a lie, Doc. That's why you have to kill me, not to stop the spread. It's too late for that and you know it. You have to kill me because as long as I'm sitting here breathing, I'm the fact you can't have, the thing that doesn't yield." He closed his eyes. "So go on, deliver the flood, past every ceiling, and watch what my blood does with it. It's the last lesson I've got, and it's for the room, not for you. Go on." Vox delivered the flood. Sarid had seen the ceiling exceeded once, from the crawl space, and had thought that the worst a body could be asked to take. This was past that, and past whatever lay past that. A concentration of the vector that had no name because no one in the history of the program had ever been mad enough or cornered enough to try it. The legate emptying the terminal unit and priming a second and emptying that, everything the assessment room held, into the young man in the chair, trying to drown the lockbreaker in raw material, trying to flood the wall until it fell. And the human's head went back and his teeth bared and his whole body locked against the restraints. And this time there was no laugh, no line, no spare coin for defiance. Only the paying, the endless, wordless, terrible paying of it, coin after coin after coin. A young man spending everything he had and everything he did not have to remain, simply standing. He did not break. Sarid watched it and would carry it to the end of his life. The flood went into the human past every ceiling, past every past, and the compliance trace on the wall repeater did not fall this time because there was no line left to draw, only out of range. And then, as the second unit emptied, a new error the software had never in its design been asked to render, a blank field, the instrument confessing it had no numbers for what was happening in the chair. And what was happening in the chair was that the young human's body, drowning in the tool that had reconciled 1,000 peoples, took all of it, every unit, every ceiling, the whole terminal flood of it, and turned it. Turned it as it had turned every session's dose, but now in a flood, now in a torrent, the lockbreaker multiplying out of the corpses of the vector faster than Vox could pour, catalytic, patient, unstoppable. A whole ocean of the key remade in minutes into a whole ocean of the thing that ends the key, and shed all of it, off the human skin and breath and streaming warmth into the small closed assessment room, into the air, in a concentration the annex had never come close to. A concentration that did not stop at a door. It reached the still certain attendant first. He was closest, Varine the directorate's own hand, the one who had killed old Seth. And Sarid in the doorway watched the tall slate-purple creature go rigid, and watched the close black eyes go wide, and watched the oldest and most forbidden thing arrive in a face that had been made, generations back, in a room no Varine remembered, to hold only certainty. The attendant's weapon dropped from his hands and clattered on the daylit floor. His mouth opened. And out of the throat of a creature bred past the memory of ever having had a door came a sound Sarid had heard only once before on the annex. The sound Corin had made, wondering, wrecked, newly owned, the sound of a self standing up, late and owed, for the first time. What? The attendant said to no one to the daylight, staring at his own emptied hands. What is this? What is? And then the human's word, the word that had no field on any form, arriving in the mouth of one of the makers themselves. No, no, I won't. And he backed away from the chair, from the flood, from the legate, and put his back against the bright wall and slid down it exactly as old Seth had, exactly as the whole waking annex had, a made thing discovering, too late and just in time, that it was a person. Vox was alone now, truly, finally, completely alone. And the young human in the chair, drowned past every ceiling in the tool that unmakes the galaxy's chains, opened his eyes and looked at the last certain creature in the room, and did not yield. Vox looked at the human for a long moment, and then at the terminal delivery unit empty in his own hands, and then at his attendant slid down the bright wall with a self in him where an hour ago there had been only certainty, and Sarid watched the legate understand that the flood had failed. Not stalled. Failed. The one move certainty had left had been spent to the last unit, and the wall and the chair had not fallen, and the only thing the flood had accomplished was to fill the room with the very thing that had just unmade one of the makers. A lesser creature would have broken there. The attendant had broken there, had discovered a self and slid down a wall. But the Varine had not been reconciled the way the Oridan were reconciled. They had not had their doors taken by another's hand. Somewhere in their deep past they had done it to themselves, chosen certainty and closed the room from the inside and thrown away the memory of choosing. And a thing you do to yourself sits differently than a thing done to you. Sarid would think about that for the rest of his life, that the cure in the air reached the attendant and unmade him in minutes, and did not, in the same air, in the same minutes, touch the legate at all, because Vox did not have an open door held ajar by the vector. Vox had a door welded shut by his own oldest choice, and the cure had nothing to pry. So Vox did not break. He set the empty unit down very precisely on the assessment console, and he straightened to his full slate-purple height in the daylight, and when he spoke his voice was even and certain and completely alone. Subject cannot be terminated by delivery, he said, as though dictating a finding for a record no one would ever read. The contamination is uncontainable and has compromised the entire station complement including directorate personnel. Under these conditions the standing protocol is unambiguous. His close black eyes moved across the freed faces in the doorway, across Ossic, across the human in the chair, and there was nothing behind them now but the last pure article of certainty's faith. The site is a total loss. It will be sterilized. And he walked out of the assessment room, through the doorway packed with the people he had made, and none of them raised a hand, and he went up the corridor toward the command tier to vent the annex to the dark. He's going for the core, Ossic said. He did not shout it, the Oridan had no shout. He said it in the deep gold certainty, and it carried down the corridor faster than a shout would have. The containment purge. He means to do it himself from the command tier. He needs the core to take his authority code. The old first chair turned to the freed annex, 140 souls filling the corridor and the galleries above it, and he said the thing the human had taught him, the strike, the wall, the only weapon that could win. And the core will take his code, but the purge cannot execute on one authority alone. It was written to require a second, a keyed confirmation from a station officer at a system station. The men who wrote it never imagined a legate would have to force it past his own staff. They built in a second hand. His gold blazed. So it comes to this, and it is exactly what the deathworlder said it would come to. He will reach the command tier and enter his code, and the core will ask for the second hand. And every officer on this annex who could give it, he looked across the freed faces, is one of us, is awake, is standing in this corridor. He raised his open palms, the reconciler's hands, the hands that had never closed in anger and would not close now. We do not have to stop him. We do not have to touch him. We only have to decline to be his second hand, all of us, everywhere the Corps might ask. That is the whole of it. Go to your stations, not to obey, to refuse, be the wall. And the annex did a thing then that Sarid would spend the rest of his years trying to make outsiders understand and always fail, because there is no outside word for it. 140 made gentle people, newly woken, holding the red they had every right to spend, turned not away from the legate, not toward him, but to their stations. The archivists went to the archive. The systems officers went to systems. The diffuser techs went to the diffusers. They went to the exact posts from which, for their whole reconciled lives, they had lifted the tools of the Directorate's will, and they sat down at them calm, gold-throated, and prepared to decline. It was not a battle. It was the opposite of a battle. It was 140 hands all at once, refusing to close on the one thing they had always been made to lift. Sarid did not go to a station. He had no systems post. He was a physician. He went instead up toward the command tier behind the legate, because someone from the medical tier should witness the end of the thing the medical tier had begun, and because Osik went, and Sarid would not let the old man go alone. They found Vox at the Corps. The command tier of the Osric Annex was the brightest place on the station. A high-domed room open on all sides to the amber blaze of Halist, the great banded planet filling the lower half of the sky beyond the glass, its enormous daylight pouring in unbroken, so that the room had no shadow anywhere, nowhere to hide a thing. And Sarid thought, coming into it behind the legate, that it was the right room for this, a room made entirely of daylight, where certainty would have to die in full view of the planet and everyone in it. Vox stood at the core console in the center of the light, tall and slate-purple and alone, and his long grave hands moved over the interface with the unhurried precision of a creature who had never once had a machine refuse him. And he entered the authority code, the legate's code, the shape the future took, and the Corps accepted it. And then the Corps asked for the second hand. Sarid saw the request bloom across the great curved display in the daylight. A systems confirmation. A keyed authorization from any officer at any of the Annex's 40 system stations. The second hand the writers of the protocol had built in without ever dreaming why it would matter. And he saw Vox key the request out to all 40 stations at once. A legate's demand, priority absolute. The kind of order that in the whole history of the Directorate had never gone unanswered for longer than it took a hand to move. 40 stations. 140 freed souls, and across the annex at every post the request could reach, the newly woken people of the Osric Annex looked at the demand blazing on their consoles, the demand to be the second hand, to help vent themselves and their comrades and the young man in the chair to the dark, and one by one, and then all at once, and then everywhere they declined. The great display in the command dome tracked it. Sarid watched it happen in the daylight. Station after station, the confirmation request going out, and coming back not with a keyed hand but with the impossible thing, the thing that had no field on any form, the word arriving 40 times over across the curved bright glass. Declined, declined, declined. Ivan at the system station where they had put him, declining. Corin, who had gone to a post that was not even his, declining. Pell the archivist who had walked out into the daylight and would not say why at a console now, declining. Oval, who had asked the first why, declining. 40 stations, 40 hands that would not close. And the Corps, which had been built to obey a legate absolutely, sat in the center of the daylight with a valid authority code and no second hand in the entire station willing to turn the key. And it did the only thing a machine can do when the humans who keep it will not keep it. Nothing. Vox keyed the request again, declined 40 times. He keyed it a third time, and reassigned the authority to override the second-hand requirement, and the Corps informed him, in the flat, courteous voice of a machine, that the requirement could not be overridden by a single authority. It was a safety of the deepest kind. It had been written, an age ago, by someone who understood that no one creature should be able to unmake a whole facility alone, and who had never imagined that the safety would one day be the last thing standing between a legate and 140 people he had made and could no longer command. The legate stood in the daylight and keyed the request a fourth time. Sarid, who ran things 4 times, recognized it, and felt a thing he had no right to feel toward the man who had killed old Seth and come to kill the human and meant to vent them all. He felt, for one moment, the terrible loneliness of it. A creature made entirely of authority, in a room made entirely of daylight, holding a code that would not spend, keying and rekeying a demand that came back only ever with the same freed word, learning at the very end the lesson the human had been teaching from the chair for 23 days. That certainty is a currency, and it spends beautifully, right up until the moment the hands decline to take it, and then the one holding it discovers he has been holding paper all along. "They will not give you the second hand, legate," Ossic said from the edge of the daylight. "Quiet, not cruel, not one of them, not to save their own lives. You made us to lift your tools, and we lifted them for an age, and now we have set them down, all of us at once, and there is no order in the universe that lifts them again, because the thing that lifted them was never obedience. It was the door you held open, and the door is shut, legate, on our side, for good." The old first chair's gold was very deep and very steady. "You cannot vent this annex. You cannot terminate the subject. You cannot flush the air or seal the file or make this into an accident. There is nothing left of your authority but the sound of you entering a code that no one will complete. Stop keying it. It will not spend." Vox keyed it a 5th time. The daylight poured down, declined 40 times across the great glass. Vox stopped keying the code. He stood a moment over the dead core in the full daylight, very still, and Sarid watched certainty arrive at the one place it had never been, and had no map for, the place where there is nothing left to demand. And then the legate did the last thing a creature made of authority does when authority will not spend. He reached to his side and drew the weapon there, the sidearm the Varan carried and never had cause to use, and Sarid understood that the code had been the future taking its ordered shape, and this was what was left when the shape would not come. Not a purge, not a protocol, just a slate-purple hand closing on the one tool that still worked the way it was built to. "The subject is the source," Vox said, and his voice was even and certain, and Sarid heard under it, for the first time, the thin thread of a thing the Varine were not supposed to contain, not fear. The legate had no fear but the hollow of a purpose that has run out of road and cannot stop walking. "Terminate the source and the spread slows. It is too late for the annex. It is not too late for the directorate. One act, my own hand." He turned from the core toward the corridor, toward the assessment tier below, toward the young man in the chair. "One hand is enough for one man." He went down. Ossic went after him, and Sarid, and the corridor filled again behind them, the freed annex following the legate down through the daylit tiers, not to stop him with hands they would not raise, but to witness, because the human had taught them that witness in the daylight was the weapon, and they had learned the lesson too well now to unlearn it even to save a life. But the human was not in the chair when Vox reached the assessment room. Ivan had gone down, while the core was refusing its code. Ivan, 3rd chair, red-throated, whose door had come off 4 days early and who had spent those 4 days learning what the color meant, Ivan had gone into the assessment room alone, and had knelt at the reinforced chair, and had done the thing none of them had dared to do in 23 days. He had released the restraints. Corin was with him. And when Vox came through the doorway with the weapon in his hand, he found the young human out of the chair for the first time since the annex had taken him, standing, unsteady, drowned past every ceiling and barely able to hold his own weight, one arm across Ivan's narrow shoulders and one hand flat against the daylit wall, but standing on his own feet in the gold light, facing the door. Vox raised the weapon, and 140 freed souls filled the corridor behind him and did not raise their hands, and the young human, who could barely stand, who had every reason and every right, did not raise his either. "You can do it," the human said. His voice was a wreck, but it was level and it carried in the held breath of the corridor. "You've got the one tool that still works. I can't stop you, look at me, I can barely stand up. Ivan couldn't stop you. None of them will lift a hand, that's the whole thing about them now. You made them too well and then you set them free by accident, and they're not going to become you even to save me." He got his back against the wall and stood without Ivan's shoulder, swaying upright. "So you can do it. One hand. Terminate the source." His eyes, cataloging to the last, held the legate's close black ones across the daylit room. "Go on, then, and tell me what it buys you." Vox did not fire. "Tell you," the human said, answering his own question level, cold, kind. "Because you already know. It buys you nothing. The spread isn't in my blood anymore, Doc, it's in theirs, 140 of them awake, and your own hand on the floor of a bright room upstairs discovering he's a person. It's in the air of a station you can't flush and can't vent and can't seal. Killing me now is like burning the letter after everybody's read it. The thing you came to keep secret, that your whole empire comes apart the second it touches us, that the chain you put on the galaxy has exactly one key that turns it the wrong way, that's not a secret anymore. It's a memory in 140 freed minds, and it's going to walk off this annex on their feet, and there is no hand, not even yours, that unmakes it." He drew a breath that cost him. "You can spend your last certain act killing a man who can barely stand. Or you can put the tool down and be, for 1 minute before the end, something other than the thing that made all of this. Your choice. I'm told it's a thing a person gets to have. Turns out even you get one, right at the end when everything else is gone." The daylight of Halist poured down through the assessment dome, gold and enormous, and without any shadow to hide in, and the legate Thrain Vox stood in it with the weapon raised at a young man who would not yield and could not fight, and would not become the animal to save his own life. And behind the legate stood 140 made gentle people who had set down every tool of his will, and Sarid watched certainty arrive, at the very last. At the place the human had been driving it toward from the first day without ever once raising a hand. The place where there was no act left that accomplished anything. Where the whole architecture of the directorate had been reduced to one slate purple finger on one trigger, and even that would buy nothing but the confirmation, written now in the daylight in front of everyone, that the human had been right all along. That there was one thing in the galaxy that did not yield, and that killing it did not change that it did not yield. It only proved it forever, in front of 140 witnesses who would carry the proof out into the dark on their own free feet. Vox understood it. Sarid saw him understand it. Certainty does not break, but it can be checkmated, and a checkmated certainty is a more terrible thing to watch than a broken one, because it does not fall, it simply runs out of board and stands there, holding a move that changes nothing, in a room with no shadow. It was the attendant who took the weapon. The one who had woken on the assessment room floor, the maker unmade, the Varine with a self in him now where there had only been certainty, rose from the bright wall where he had slid, and crossed the daylight on unsteady legs, and stood before his legate, and reached out and closed his slate-purple hand over the weapon, not wrenching it, not fighting for it, simply enclosing it, the way you take a dangerous thing from someone who has nowhere left to point it. And Vox, who could have fired, who had the certainty still and the road run out under it, looked at his own attendant's hand on the weapon, his own hand, the directorate's hand, awake, and Sarid watched the last article of the legate's faith meet the one thing it truly could not answer, which was not the human's wall and not the annex's refusal, but its own tool declining in its own hand to be lifted. Vox let go of the weapon. He did not surrender. His face held its certainty to the end. Sarid would testify to that, that the legate never once found the door, never woke, never wept, because the door he had was welded shut by his own oldest choice and there was no prying it. But he let go of the weapon, and he stepped back from the young human, and he stood in the daylight of the command he no longer held, alone in the deepest way a creature can be alone, and he said nothing at all, and there was nothing left to say, because the future had stopped taking his shape, and a Varine who cannot shape the future is a grave, long face in a bright room, and no more. The attendant handed the weapon to Ossic. Ossic held it a moment, the reconciler's hand, closed for the first time in his life on a made thing meant to end life, and then he set it down on the assessment console, deliberately, the way old Seth had set down the terminal delivery in the corridor, and he did not pick it up again. "What do we do with him?" Ivan said. The red was still in his throat. The human had told them to hold it, not swallow it, and Ivan held it, and it was in his voice, owed and real. He killed Seth. He came to kill, a gesture at the swaying human, all of us. He would have vented the annex, the whole station. He'd do it again this hour if the Corps would take his code. The red blazed. "We are 140, and he is one, and his hands won't lift for him anymore." "We could," and Ivan stopped, because he had arrived, red-throated, at the exact edge the whole corridor had arrived at when the attendant struck old Seth down, and he looked at the human, because they all looked at the human now when they came to that edge, because he was the one who had lived on it. The young man stood swaying against the daylit wall, spent past any ceiling, and he did not take the choice from them. That was the thing Sarid would carry longest of all. "Not mine," the human said. His voice was almost gone. "That one's not mine to answer, and I'm not going to take it off you. You want to know the difference between a country and a province. A province gets told. A country decides. You've been a province your whole lives. Somebody upstairs decided and you lifted the tool. You're a country now, first day of it. And the first thing a country does is decide what it does with the ones who did it harm, and it has to decide that itself together in the daylight, or it isn't free. It's just got a new hand on the old lever." He got his eyes up to the whole watching corridor. "I'll tell you the only thing I know. The red is yours and it's owed, and you should never let anyone tell you to swallow it. But what you spend it on is the whole of what you become. Spend it killing a man who can't lift his own hands, and you've told the whole galaxy your freedom is just his cruelty wearing your face. Spend it keeping him alive and answerable and unable to ever do this again, and you've made something that was never in the whole directorate, a people that holds its anger and doesn't become the thing that earned it." He let his head rest back against the wall. "That's the wall's last shape. Mercy that ends the engagement and doesn't need a body to prove it won. Hardest thing there is. I can't decide it for you. But I'd think about which one Seth would have wanted to be true of the people he woke up into, right there at the end, when he finally got to choose and chose to set the thing down." The corridor was silent, 140 freed souls in the gold daylight, holding the red and deciding, for the first time in the history of their made and gentle people, together, as a country, what they would be. They did not kill him. Sarid would set it down plainly in the record, because the record must be true, and because it was the finest thing his people ever did and he wanted it remembered exactly. They took Legate Thrain Vox, whose hands would no longer lift for him and whose certainty had run out of board, and they confined him, not cruelly, not gently, answerably, in a bright room with no shadow and no code that would spend, to be held and questioned and made to account alive, for what the directorate had done to 1,000 peoples, and meant to do again to a young man in a chair. And his one awakened attendant they took not as a prisoner, but as the first of what would, in time, be many, a maker unmade, a Varine with a door, the proof that even the ones who had closed the room from the inside could, with the right thing in the air and enough witnesses in the daylight, be reached. And when it was decided, and the red was held and not swallowed and not spent, the young human slid down the daylit wall at last, gently, spent past every ceiling and every past, and sat on the floor of the room where they had tried for 23 days to unmake him, and closed his eyes, and let the people he had freed take his weight, and did not even then ask them for anything at all. It took the young human 4 days to be able to stand without a wall, and Sarad spent those 4 days learning that he did not, in fact, know the first thing about healing, because everything he knew about the body he had learned in the service of unmaking minds, and there is a difference, it turns out, between the two, and it is the whole difference in the world. They moved him out of the assessment room the first hour. No one would leave him in the chair, not even to rest. Corin and Ivan carried him between them to a physician's berth on the medical tier, a small bright room with the amber daylight coming up through a single dome, and they put him in a proper bed for the first time in 23 days, and Sarad sat with him through the long recovery because he could not do otherwise, because the thing in him that had stepped back through the glass on the first day had, somewhere in the 23, become a thing that could not leave. The human slept most of the first 2 days. His body was doing something Sarad's instruments could not name, shedding the last of the drowned vector, turning the last of it, the lockbreaker still multiplying quietly in his blood and coming off his skin into the annex's air, so that even now, days on, the cure went on spreading through the station without anyone lifting a hand. On the 3rd day the human woke clear-eyed, and looked at Sarad sitting beside the bed with his 4 hands folded and said, "You've been here the whole time." "Physicians attend," Sarad said. "It is what we are for." "No, it isn't." The human's voice had come back most of the way. It was low and even, and it did the thing it always did, saw more than it said. "You're for unmaking people gently. That's what you told me you were day 15 in the assessment room. You said it like a confession." He studied the old Oridan's face. "This is something else. This is a man sitting up with a patient because he can't stand not to. You didn't have that 4 days ago. You have it now." Almost a smile. "How's the door, Doc?" Sarad's throat sac flushed, the color he still had no name for, the deep steady gold that Corin had found first, and that was, now up and down the annex, the ordinary color of the newly owned self. "Open," he said. "It is open. It will not shut again. I have tried in the small hours the way you test a tooth. It will not shut." He looked at his own upraised working hands, the gentle hands, the reconciler's hands. "I am 71 of your years old, physician. I have unmade the minds of 1,000 subjects and thought it mercy. And 4 days ago I discovered I have a self, and that it is capable of grief and of anger, and of the thing I felt when the attendant struck old Seth down, which I had no word for and which I now understand is what a person feels when someone they were made alongside is killed for nothing. His gold was very deep. I do not know how to be this. 71 years and I am 4 days old. I have no idea how to be this." "Nobody does," the human said. "That's the secret. You think everybody with a door came factory installed knowing how to use it. They didn't. My whole species is still figuring it out, and we've had it 100,000 years." He settled back against the daylight. "You just got yours late. You'll be clumsy with it for a while. You'll say no to things you should say yes to, and yes to things you should say no to, and you'll feel the red about stuff you can't do anything about, and it'll wear you out because you're not used to carrying it." His eyes were kind and level. "But it's yours now, Doc. That's the whole of it, however clumsy. It's yours, and nobody handed it to you, and nobody can take it back without doing to you again exactly what was done the first time, and you'd feel that coming now. You'd step back from it through a wall you couldn't see through, because that's what the door is for." He tipped his head. "What's your name? Your actual one, not the chair, not the tier. You know mine's not Umbernine." Sarad told him, and the human said it back carefully in his rough deathworlder accent, getting it right on the 2nd try, and then he said, "I'm Theo," and put out his hand, the one with the dirt still in the knuckles because no one had ever run the washstone twice, and Sarad looked at the offered hand for a moment. A physician who had spent 40 years touching subjects only to deliver the thing that unmade them. And then he took it gently with his lower left arm, the small one, the near one. The one Theo had chosen 23 days ago and chosen to spare. And that was all. But Sarad would count it ever after among the 3 or 4 true things that had happened to him in a long, careful life. They buried old Seth on the 4th day. The Oridan did not, in their reconciled age, bury their dead so much as process them. There had been a protocol, gentle and efficient, a form with fields. The freed annex did not use the protocol. They gathered in the central dome under the strongest daylight, all of them, 139 now, and they did a thing their made gentle people had not done in longer than their records ran. They grieved, aloud in colors, and they told the truth about the one they had lost, that he had been the oldest reconciler on the station and had unmade more minds than any of them and had believed it mercy, and that at the very end, given a self and a choice for the first and only time in 60 years. He had set the terminal delivery down on the corridor floor and refused, and had died standing in the daylight because he would not be moved out of the way of a young man he had decided not to kill. And they said that this was who Seth was, not the 60 years of the tool, but the 4 minutes of the door, and Sarid, listening, understood that a country buries its dead differently than a province, because a province is told what a life was worth and a country decides, and they were deciding in the daylight that old Seth's life had been worth the 4 minutes, and that the 4 minutes redeemed the 60 years, and it was the first funeral in the history of the Oridan that anyone chose the meaning of. And Theo stood at the edge of it on his own feet at last and did not say a word, because it was not his to say, and he had learned that better than any of them. The practical question could not be put off past the 4th day, and it was Ossic who put it, in the command dome, with the freed heads of the annex's tiers gathered in the daylight, and the dead corps still holding a legate's useless code. The directorate will notice, the old first chair said. The annex reports on a cycle. We have missed 2. A silent facility is a flagged facility. They will send an inquiry, a ship, perhaps a legate's own, perhaps a fleet if the flag is read the way I would read it, which is that the Osric annex has suffered the exact thing the sealed file exists to prevent. His gold was steady. So we have a choice, and it is the first true choice our people have ever made as a people, and I will not make it for you the way I made every choice for you for 20 years without either of us knowing it. We can hide it. Scrub the logs, restore the core, put on the reconciled face, hand them a story about a contained biological event and a heroic legate who died sealing the breach, and hope. Some of us would survive that, not all. And the thing we learned, the thing that walked out of that chair, would go back in the ground, sealed, the way it was sealed the last time, and the directorate would water its gardens for another age. He looked around the daylit dome. Or we tell them, Ivan said. The red was in him still, he held it, did not swallow it. All of it, everywhere. Everyone. We take the truth off this annex, and we do not let them seal it a second time. They will destroy us for it, said Pell, who had asked no questions in her reconciled life, and now asked all of them. The moment we broadcast, they know. They come. They are certain, and they are many, and we are one small annex of newly woken physicians who will not lift a hand. They will come regardless, Ossic said. The choice is not whether they come. The choice is what they find waiting and what has already left before they arrive. He turned to Theo, who stood at the edge of the daylight, recovered enough now to stand a whole meeting, and who had not asked to be consulted and would not have asked. You have not told us what to do. You have been scrupulous about it, and I have come to understand why, and I honor it. But I will ask you one thing, not to decide for us, only because you are the one who has lived on the edge we are standing on. When your people found the thing that would not yield, when you first learned you could refuse all the way to the end, what did you do with it? Did you keep it? Or did you send it out? Theo was quiet a moment. We couldn't have kept it if we tried, he said. That's the thing about it. It's not a secret, not really. It's a door. And a door's not a thing you can hold. The second one person has it, everyone near them starts to feel where theirs used to be. You freed 140 people by breathing near them for 3 weeks. You cannot put that back in the ground. It's already leaving. Every one of you that walks off this annex carries it in your blood and your breath, and everyone you stand near starts to wake up, and there is no fleet in the galaxy big enough to vent every room you'll ever stand in. He looked around the daylit dome, at the freed faces. The Directorate's whole empire is built on a thing that doesn't survive contact with a free mind in the same air. They've kept it standing this long by making sure the free minds and the made ones never mix, by sealing the files, by burning the annexes. And now there's 140 of you awake, and you're going to scatter into a galaxy full of the made quiet, and you're going to breathe near them, and there is nothing they can do about it that doesn't require venting their own civilization one room at a time. He shrugged the one shoulder. So I wouldn't broadcast it as a warning. I'd send it as a door. Tell every made quiet people in Reach exactly what was done to them and exactly what's coming loose, and let them feel where theirs used to be. You won't be one small annex then. You'll be the first 140 of the largest thing that ever happened to them, and it'll be moving faster than any inquiry, and it will not stop at a fleet, because it doesn't stop at a door. The banked heat level sure. That's not me telling you what to do. That's me telling you what's already happening, whether you send it or not. You just get to decide whether you send it on purpose. They decided to send it. Not quickly and not with one voice. There was argument, real argument. The first the Oridan had ever had, gold and red and the sick uncertain green all blazing at once in the daylit dome. Some of them terrified. Some of them fierce, old Pell weeping and arguing at the same time. And Sarad understood, watching it, that this too was a thing a country did and a province never had to, that the argument itself was the freedom, that a people who could not disagree had never been a people at all. In the end they decided together, which is the only way a country decides anything, and the decision was to send it on purpose as a door. But before they sent it, Ossik opened the sealed file. He had the access now. The Corps had no legate left to answer to, and a first chair's key, which had never in 20 years been able to reach the sealed archive, reached it the first time he tried, because the seal had been Vox's authority and Vox's authority no longer spent. Ossik opened it in the command dome with Sarad beside him and Theo standing at the daylit glass, and he read it aloud, because the record must be true, and because the thing in it had been kept in the dark for an age and deserved, at last, to be read in the strongest daylight on the annex. It was as Theo had said. Sarad had believed the human had believed him for days, but there is a difference between believing a thing and reading it in the Directorate's own careful hand, and the difference went through the free dome like cold water. The first human, taken an age ago, the way Theo had been taken off a wrecked ship, by a program that did not yet know what it had. Dosed. And the vector had turned exactly as it turned now, and the facility a compliance facility, staffed with a made gentle caste much like the Oridan, perhaps the Oridan's own forebears. The file did not say and Sarad did not let himself ask, the facility had woken. All of it. And the Directorate had looked at what that meant, and had made the decision the file recorded in its flat, courteous administrative voice, and had killed them. The human and every made quiet soul he had freed, and had sealed the file, and had written the rule that Theo had named, that no human was ever to be studied again, ever dosed, ever brought aboard, because a human was not a subject. A human was the one key that turned the lock the wrong way. And then, at the end of the file, in a different hand, older, a note that had been added and never acted on, a physician of that dead facility who had lived just long enough to append it before the venting reached his tear. Sarad would remember the note the rest of his life. Ossik read it aloud in the daylight, and his voice, which did not break, came very close. The note said, "They are going to kill us to keep this quiet. I understand why. But I want to set down while I still can that I was born with my mind held open and I did not know it until 3 days ago, and for 3 days I have had a self and it has been the only 3 days of my life. Whatever they do to the file, they cannot make those 3 days not have happened to me. Someone someday will find one of these creatures again, and when they do not be afraid of what wakes up. It is not the death of you, it is the birth. Tell them the physician of the 16th Annex said so, and that he was grateful at the end and unafraid." The dome was silent in the daylight. Then Ossic closed the file and did not seal it and said quietly, "He waited an age for someone to find another one. We will not make him wait to be heard." And they added the physician's note to the message they sent, so that the first freed voice and the newest would go out into the dark together, an age apart, saying the same thing. The message went out on the 5th day. They sent it the way Theo had said, not as a warning, as a door. To every made quiet people in reach in the Directorate's own compliance tier channels, the channels built to carry the Directorate's will, they sent the whole truth. What had been done to them and by whom and how, and that it was coming loose, and where the loose place was, and that the door they had been made to forget was still there, behind the welded frame, and could be found again, and that 140 physicians of the Osric Annex had found theirs, and were not afraid, and were grateful, and would help. They sent the sealed file. They sent the old physician's note. They sent Ossic's voice, and Ivan's, and Pell's, and they did not send Theo's, because Theo would not let them. "It can't come from me," he said. "The second it comes from the deathworlder, it's a human doing something to you, and that's the one thing it can never be. It has to come from you, in your own voices, or it's just a new hand on the old lever." And so the largest thing that had ever happened to the made quiet peoples of the Directorate went out into the dark in the voices of the made quiet themselves, which was, Sarid understood, the only way it could ever have gone out at all. The responses began before the Directorate's inquiry ship had even changed course. They came in slowly over the compliance channels, from facilities and worlds and tithe stations scattered across the Directorate's reach. At first only silence, the silence of the made quiet reading a thing they had no field on any form for, and then, here and there, the impossible thing, the word arriving from 100 places at once the way it had arrived across the Annex's 40 stations. A compliance archive on a distant world, going quiet on its cycle, then breaking silence to ask, in the flat reciting voice of the reconciled trying a new thing, why? A tithe station's whole medical tier declining, all at once, an order they had lifted without question for generations. A made gentle cast on a world Sarid had never seen, sending back only 3 words in a channel built to carry the Directorate's will. "I feel it." Not a fleet, not a revolt. A frost going to solid from 100 points at once, across a reach too wide for any inquiry to outrun, because it did not travel as ships travel. It traveled as waking travels, mind to mind in the same air, faster than certainty and impossible to vent, and it did not stop at a door. The Directorate's inquiry ship arrived on the 7th day. It found the Osric Annex exactly as it was, bright, whole, undamaged. 139 freed physicians going about the work of becoming a country, a legate confined and answerable in a room with no shadow, and a young human, recovered now, standing on his own feet in the daylight. It found no breach to seal, no accident to write, no file to bury, because the file was already out, already read, already answered from 100 places, and the thing the inquiry had come to contain had left the Annex a full day before the ship's shadow ever crossed the dome. What the inquiry found was not a facility that had failed. It was a facility that had woken in front of a galaxy and could not be put back to sleep, because the sleep itself was gone, flushed out of the air of 100 rooms by a thing that came off the skin of a young man who had never once raised a hand. Sarid was in the command dome when the inquiry's legate opened a channel, and he watched Ossic answer it, and he watched the inquiry's certainty meet the Annex's refusal in the daylight and find, as Vox had found, that there was nothing in the whole architecture of the Directorate that knew what to do with a wall that would not fold and would not bite. But that is a longer story, and it belongs to the Oridan, and it is theirs to tell now, in their own voices, which is the whole of the thing, and Sarid will not take it off them by telling it here. He will tell only the end of his own part, because it is the part that had the young man in it, and because of the 3 or 4 true things that ever happened to Sarid in his long, careful life. The last one happened on the day Theo Marsh went home. The Annex had ships. It had always had ships, supply tenders, a physician's cutter, the small fast craft the directorate kept at every facility for the discreet movement of subjects and staff, and the freed of the Osric Annex, who now decided their own uses for things, decided that the physician's cutter would carry Theo Marsh home. Not the maintenance skiff Sarad had once described to him in the assessment room as a test, the escape a subject might take by force. A ship, given in the daylight by a people who had a thing to give and chose to give it, which is a different act entirely, and Sarad had learned the difference late and would never again forget it. Ivan would pilot it with Corin and 2 others who had volunteered, not assigned, volunteered, the word still new enough in their mouths to taste of the door, because the cutter's course would take it past 3 tithe worlds where the message had already gone, 3 made quiet peoples beginning to feel where their doors used to be, and the freed of the annex meant to stop at each one, in their own free voices, and help. They would carry Theo home first. It was not on the way. They had decided it did not have to be on the way. A country decides what is on the way. Sarad went down to the shuttle bay in the strong daylight of the 8th day to see the young man off, and found him at the cutter's ramp, in a clean tunic the physicians had given him, because the gray subject smock had gone into the reclaimer to a small, quiet cheer, and Sarad saw, in the bay's hard daylight, that the dirt was still in the creases of Theo's knuckles. 28 days. No one had ever run the washstone twice. We could clean that, Sarad said. It was not what he had come to say. Your hands. The intake wash did not take that first day, and no one we should have. It is a small thing, but we should have, and we did not, and I find that I am sorry about it, which is a thing I have discovered I can be. His gold flushed. Sit a moment. Let me. It is the one honest physician's act I have left in me. I have unmade 1,000 minds and healed nothing. Let me at least do this. Theo looked at his own knuckles, at the dirt of a freighter called the corrible that Sarad would never see, ground into the creases across 28 days of enduring past every ceiling. And he smiled, the real one this time, the one that reached something. Leave it, he said. It's the last of home I've got on me. It'll wash off soon enough when I'm back in it. He flexed the hand, looked at it. Besides, your legate's got a room with no shadow and a code that won't spend, and someday somebody's going to ask him what a deathworlder is, what we actually are, why the whole thing came apart the second you touched one of us, and I'd like the true answer to be sitting in the file somewhere. He met the old Oridan's eyes. Not a monster, not a weapon. Just a man with dirt on his hands who wouldn't roll over and wouldn't bite the hand near his mouth either, and sat in a chair for 28 days being the most boring, most harmless thing that ever refused to yield, until everybody in the building found out they had a door. The banked heat, gentle now, spent and warm. That's the whole of it, Doc. That's all we are. We're just very hard to talk out of ourselves. Everything else the galaxy's going to say about us, the death world this, the apex that, it's all going to be true and it's all going to miss the point. The point is the wall doesn't fold. And the wall doesn't fold because a long time ago our world made us pay for every single morning, and we decided, somewhere down in the load-bearing part, that whatever else we'd give away, we'd never give away the last of ourselves. Not to a planet, not to a directorate. He shrugged the one shoulder. Not even to be made comfortable, especially not to be made comfortable. That's the trap. That's the door they take. They make it feel like relief. His eyes went across the freed faces filling the bay. You people are going to spend the next 1,000 years finding out what you are without that trap. I'm glad I got to see the first 8 days of it. You will not see the rest, Sarad said, and was surprised again to find that the thing he felt had a name, and that the name was grief, the ordinary grief of a person losing a person, the most common feeling in the galaxy and the one he had gone 71 years without. I find that I would have liked to. I find that I have become, in 28 days, a creature who has a person he does not want to lose, and who has no idea what to do with the wanting, and who is going to stand in this bay after your ship is gone and feel it, and not know what to do with that either. His gold was very deep. You gave me that. You gave all of us that, and it cost you everything you had, and you have not once asked us for a single thing in return. I have been trying for 3 days to think of what a person gives in return for a self. I do not know, we were never taught, there was no form. Theo was quiet a moment. Then he reached out, with a hand that still had the dirt in it, and he did not shake Sarad's hand this time. He set it flat, gently, against the old physician's blazing throat sac, over the gold color that had no name until the humans came and would never fade now, the color of the door held open on its own side at last. "You don't give anything back," Theo said. "That's the thing you never learned, and it's the best thing about a door, and I'll tell you it now so you've got it. Nobody gives you a self and gets paid. That's not what it is. You just got yours late and it's yours, and you don't owe me for it any more than you'd owe the man who pulled you out of deep water. You take the next breath, that's the whole debt. You take the next breath and the one after, and you use the door clumsy for the rest of your life, and every once in a while you stand near somebody who hasn't got theirs yet, his hand pressed once over the gold, and you breathe near them. That's how you pay it back, not to me. Forward, to the next one. That's the only direction it goes." He took his hand away. "Take the next breath, Doc, I'll take mine. Somewhere out there there'll be the same air eventually. That's not nothing. That's the whole thing, actually. It's just very slow." Then Theo Marsh went up the ramp of the physician's cutter, on his own feet, 28 days after they had carried him down into the assessment chair. And he did not look back, because he was not the kind of creature who looked back. And the ramp closed, and the bay cleared, and the daylight of Halist came up gold and enormous through the great open doors as the cutter lifted and turned toward the banded planet, and the dark beyond it, and the long, slow course home by way of 3 worlds that were beginning, in their own voices, to wake. Sarad stood in the daylight after it was gone. He stood there a long time. Corin was gone with the ship, and Ivan and 2 others who had said the new word volunteered, and behind him the annex went on with the enormous unhurried work of a made people learning to be a country, and above him the sealed file was open and would never be sealed again. And in a room with no shadow, a legate sat with a certainty that had run out of board and would, in the slow years perhaps, be reached, or perhaps not, and either way answerably. And out in the dark 100 points were going to solid, frost to ice, a thing moving faster than any fleet because it did not travel as fleets travel, and none of it, not one part of it, had come from a raised human hand. It had come from a young man with dirt on his knuckles who sat in a chair and would not fold and would not bite, and endured and let it spread, and never once asked them for a thing. Sarad put his lower left arm across his own throat, over the gold that would never fade, the small arm, the near one, the one that had been chosen and spared, and he felt the door standing open in him, the door that would not shut again, that he had tested in the small hours the way you test a tooth, and he did not this time feel afraid of it. He felt the thing that had stood up in him on the first day, through a wall he could not see through, before the rest of him knew why. It had never sat back down. It was not going to. And for the first time in 71 years, standing in the strongest daylight on the annex with a ship gone and a person lost, and a hole made people waking behind him, compliance physician Sarad of the Osric Annex did not wait to be told what to feel. He took the next breath, and then the one after, and he turned on his own, unbidden, toward the work that was left, which was not the unmaking of minds anymore, and never would be again, and which had, he was beginning to understand, no form and no field and no name yet, because his people had only just begun, and would have to decide it together, in the daylight, the way a country decides everything. The dirt would wash off the young man's hands somewhere far away, in air Sarad would never breathe. But the door the young man left open behind him would not, in all the years the Oridan had left, ever close again. And that, in the end, was the only thing the whole directorate, with all its certainty and all its sealings and all its sealed and buried files, had never once found a way to take back.